A woman lies amidst the white snow, her blood staining the ground in a winter storm. Surrounding her are the richest, most dangerous men in America, and they all want her dead. Only one person steps forward. Not a cop, not a good guy. The most notorious mob boss on the East Coast, a man the entire criminal underworld fears. Why does he save her? What secret is she hiding that the mafia wants to wipe her out? And when the truth is revealed, will love be strong enough to stand against an entire criminal empire? Watch until the end. Like and comment the city you're watching in, so I know how far this story has progressed. The blizzard had been building since noon, and by 9 that evening it had turned the Catskill Mountains into something biblical and merciless. Snow drove sideways off the ridgeline, slamming against the stone face of Black Hollow Estate with enough force to rattle the leaded windows in their frames. The temperature had dropped below zero before the last car arrived. The plows had stopped running 2 hours ago. Nothing moved on the mountain road except the storm itself, and even that seemed purposeful. Like the weather understood what was happening inside and had decided to seal it off from the rest of the world. Inside, the annual winter summit of the East Coast's most dangerous men was already 3 hours deep into its second bottle of the evening. The main hall of Black Hollow had been built in 1889 by a railroad baron who wanted his guests to feel small. He had succeeded. 40-foot ceilings vaulted overhead, hung with iron chandeliers that threw amber light across faces that had ordered murders the way other men ordered dinner. Persian rugs ran the length of the hall. Mahogany paneling absorbed the sound of conversations that could not legally exist. Violinists played near the east windows. 3 young men who had learned quickly not to make eye contact with the guests, not to listen, and above all not to remember. 12 families were represented, 41 men in total, counting security. And at the head of the room, standing slightly apart from the rest as he always did, was Lucien Devereaux. He held a glass of scotch he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. He was watching the room the way a chess player watches a board. Not moving, not speaking, calculating 4 moves ahead while everyone else celebrated the present. He was 38 years old and looked it in all the wrong ways. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't come from laughter. His dark hair was shot through with gray at the temples that he had never bothered to address because vanity had always struck him as a liability. He wore a black suit that cost more than most people's cars and wore it like a man who didn't notice what he was dressed in. His face was the kind of face that made people instinctively step back when they first saw it. Not because it was ugly, but because something in the structure of it, the stillness of it, communicated danger at a frequency that bypassed rational thought. People who worked for Lucien Devereaux described him in consistent terms. Precise. Efficient. Without mercy, when mercy was a strategic disadvantage. In 15 years, he had consolidated more power along the eastern seaboard than any single operator since the commission collapsed. He had never been indicted, never been photographed doing anything criminal, never left fingerprints on anything that mattered. The underworld called him the Devil of Black Hollow. He preferred not to be called anything at all. A man named Caruso was telling a story near the fireplace, laughing too loudly, his thick hands gesturing expansively. And 2 of his lieutenants were laughing along with the practiced enthusiasm of men whose continued employment depended on finding the boss funny. Lucien observed this without expression. Caruso ran the waterfront operations out of Jersey and was 3 months behind on the arrangement they had discussed in October. Lucien had not forgotten this. He had simply decided the summit was not the right venue for that particular conversation. The right venue would come later. It always did. Marco Aldano appeared at Lucien's shoulder. His head of security, a compact, quiet man from the Bronx who had been with him for 11 years and had earned the rare distinction of being someone Lucien actually listened to. He leaned close without touching. "Paletti's man keeps making phone calls outside," he murmured. "3rd time in the last hour." "To whom?" "Can't say yet. Find out before the dessert course." Marco nodded and withdrew without a sound. Lucien sipped his scotch. He looked toward the windows, where the storm had plastered sheets of snow against the glass thick enough to turn the panes white. He had hosted this summit for 9 years. Black Hollow was the only venue where the families felt genuinely safe, partly because of its isolation, partly because of the security infrastructure Lucien had spent $4 million installing beneath its floors and inside its walls, but mostly because everyone understood that Black Hollow was Lucien's house, and what happened inside Black Hollow happened on Lucien's terms. That was the unspoken agreement. That was why the scream from the servants' corridor froze the room like a blade dropped on marble. It wasn't loud. That was the thing that made it cut through the music and the conversation. It was the kind of scream that had been partially swallowed, like someone had started it and then stopped themselves, like the act of screaming was itself dangerous. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then nothing. The violins stopped. Conversations halted mid-sentence. 41 men in expensive suits turned toward the sound. Lucien was already moving. He didn't run. He never ran. But he moved with a speed and directness that parted the crowd ahead of him without anyone quite deciding to step aside. He went through the main hall, down the east corridor, past the coat room and the back kitchen where 2 of the catering staff stood frozen by the rear service door with the look of people who had just seen something they desperately wanted to unsee. "Where?" Lucien said. One of them pointed at the door. He pushed through it into the blizzard. The cold hit him like something physical, driving the air out of his lungs in a cloud of vapor. Snow drove against his face and immediately soaked through the shoulders of his jacket. He had no coat. He didn't go back for one. He stood on the service steps for 2 full seconds, letting his eyes adjust, scanning the white darkness. Then he saw it. The blood was black against the snow in the poor light. A trail of it, not heavy but consistent, drops falling every 18 inches or so. It led away from the service door and curved around the side of the estate toward the garden. He followed it with his jaw set and the Scotch glass still in his hand because he had forgotten he was carrying it. She was 20 yards from the garden wall, face down in the snow. A young woman. Dark hair splayed across the white ground, soaked with blood on one side where something had opened her scalp. She was dressed in the black and white uniform of the catering staff, thin fabric designed for warmth indoors and nothing else. One shoe was missing. The bare foot was already gray. Her hand was wrapped around something at her throat. He could see the chain of it between her fingers, but not what it was. The bruises around her neck were visible from 10 feet away. Lucien stopped, stood over her for a moment, looked at the estate wall, the garden, the storm. Thought about what this meant, finding a body outside during a summit. Thought about the conversation it would require, the questions, the positions it would force him into. He felt something move through him that wasn't calculation. He handed the Scotch glass to the air. Marco was there, somehow, already, and dropped to one knee in the snow. He pressed 2 fingers to her carotid. A pulse, thin and fast, like a bird caught in someone's hand. She was breathing in shallow, rapid pulls. Her lips were starting to turn. "Get Hennessy," Lucien said. "Now." "The guests," someone started behind him. "I don't give a damn about the guests. Get the doctor to my medical wing in 3 minutes or find a new job." He got both arms under her, one beneath her knees, one across her back, and lifted her from the snow. She weighed almost nothing. He turned and carried her back through the service door and into the warmth of the estate. He walked through the kitchen. He walked through the rear corridor. He walked into the main hall. He did not take the back route. He took the direct route, straight through the center of the summit, where 41 of the most dangerous men on the eastern seaboard stood in their expensive suits with their expensive drinks, watching Lucien Devereaux carry an unconscious, bleeding woman through his own ballroom with the expression of a man whose patience for the world had reached its absolute limit. Blood dripped from her hair onto the marble floor. Nobody spoke. Not one word. Not one question. Because the man carrying her looked the way he looked precisely once in a decade, and anyone who had been in the same room the last time it happened was either in prison or in the ground. Lucien carried her through the hall and down the north corridor to the private medical wing without looking at a single guest. He laid her on the examination table himself. He stepped back. He put both hands flat on the counter behind him and stood there in the silence of that room. Snow still melting off his shoulders, blood on the front of his jacket, her blood, and stared at the far wall for a count of 10 while something worked itself through him that he didn't have a clean name for. Then Hennessy came through the door with his bag, and Lucy stepped out of the way. He stood in the corridor outside and waited. Marco appeared at his elbow without being summoned. "The guests are asking questions," Marco said. "They can ask questions." "What do I tell them?" "Tell them whoever put her in that snow is no longer welcome in this house." Marco absorbed this. And if it's one of them? Lucien looked at him. Then they're about to have a very significant problem. Hennessy worked for an hour. Lucien stood in the corridor for all of it. The guests eventually returned to their conversations, their drinks, their carefully constructed pretense that nothing had happened. A few tried to approach Lucien directly. Marco redirected all of them with a quietness that conveyed exactly the right amount of unavailability. When Hennessy finally emerged, he looked tired in the specific way that doctors look tired when they'd been working against the cold. Hypothermia, beginning stage, he said without preamble. Head laceration, serious but not critical. She didn't fracture the skull. The bruising on her neck is manual strangulation, someone's hands, recent. There are older injuries too. Rib, healed badly, probably 6 months ago. Wrist, same. She's been... He paused. Someone has been hurting this woman for a while. Lucien said nothing. She's stable. She needs rest and warmth. If she'd been outside another 15 minutes... Hennessy didn't finish the sentence. Stay close, Lucien said. Of course. Lucien went back into the room. She was on the bed now, covered. Her dark hair spread carefully across the pillow. The color was coming back into her face in slow degrees. Hennessy had cleaned the wound at her temple and dressed it. Without the blood and the snow and the urgency, she looked younger than he had estimated. Mid-20s, maybe. Sharp features under the bruising. Calloused hands. He noticed that. Not the hands of someone who spent their time in ballrooms. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He had questions. He could wait. He was exceptionally good at waiting. She woke at 2 in the morning, disoriented and thrashing. He spoke before she could scream. You're indeed. You're warm. Nobody is going to hurt you in this room. She went still. Her eyes found him across the dim light, dark eyes, wide, reading the room the way someone read a room when they'd spent years in rooms that turned dangerous without warning. She assessed the exits. He watched her do it. She checked the window, the door, the distance between herself and the nightstand, all of it in under 3 seconds. That was not the behavior of a frightened maid. Who are you? She said. Her voice was rough from the cold and the strangulation both. My name is Lucien Devereaux. This is my house. He paused. You were found outside in the snow. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief. The opposite of relief. She made a movement toward the edge of the bed. I need to leave. You had hypothermia 3 hours ago. You're not leaving. You don't understand. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, and immediately the room tilted. He could see it in her face, the color leaving, and he was up and had her by the arm before she hit the floor, lowering her back to the bed with a control he usually reserved for entirely different kinds of situations. Easy, he said. Her whole body was shaking, not from cold. The room was warm. Something else. I can't be here, she said, voice cracking. If they find me here. Who? He said. She closed her mouth, looked at him, said nothing. That silence told him more than anything she could have said. In the days that followed, she gave her name as Serafina Vale. She ate little and spoke less. She flinched at sounds that other people didn't register. A door closing too fast. Raised voices 2 rooms away, footsteps in the corridor. She slept in fragments, never longer than 2 hours at a stretch, and when she slept facing the door. Lucien had seen men come back from war who slept the same way. He gave her space. He had his staff provide food and clothing and anything else she needed. He didn't press her for information, even though the need for it was growing by the hour, because someone in his house had put a woman in the snow during his summit, and that was the kind of thing that required a thorough accounting. But Lucien knew how to read people. And what he read in Serafina Vale, in the military efficiency of her instincts, the way she positioned herself in rooms, the 3-second exit assessment every time a door opened, the scars on her wrists that she kept covered but that Hennessy had noted in his report. What he read was not the profile of a temporary catering employee. He ran a quiet search through channels he trusted. The fingerprint result came back 48 hours later. Lucien sat at his desk in the north study and read the file twice. Serafina Vale did not exist. The fingerprints matched a cold case in Interpol's database, a missing persons file that had been active for 10 years without resolution. The name attached to the prints was Evelyn Marrow, 24 years old. Last confirmed location, Zurich, Switzerland. 14 months ago. Her father was Adrian Marrow. Lucian knew that name. Everyone in the room at his summit knew that name. Adrian Marrow had been the chief accountant for the Romano Syndicate for 11 years. He was the kind of man who knew where every dollar moved, which meant he knew where every body was buried in the financial sense of the phrase, and occasionally in the literal one. He had vanished 10 years ago under circumstances the Romano family had always described as a tragic accident involving a vehicle and a river. A story that became considerably less credible when it emerged that Adrian Marrow had spent the months before his disappearance quietly photographing documents, copying files, and constructing what investigators later described as the most comprehensive financial record of organized criminal activity ever assembled on the eastern seaboard. The files were never recovered. His daughter was never found. Until a woman with her fingerprints had been found bleeding in the snow outside Black Hollow Estate during a summit attended by representatives of every major criminal organization that had ever paid Romano for protection. Lucien closed the file. He sat with the information for a long time, turning it over, understanding the geometry of it. The daughter of Adrian Marrow, in his house, during the summit. The attack on her. Not random. Not a robbery. Someone at the summit had recognized her, and instead of reporting it through the usual channels, had decided to handle it quietly and had failed. He had two options. The first was to hand her over. To Matteo Romano, who ran the family now, and who would travel personally to collect her if Lucien made the call. This was the rational option. This was the option that kept Black Hollow out of a war it hadn't started and wasn't obligated to fight. The second option was the one he was already moving toward, and had been since he saw the bruises around her throat. He went to the library that evening. She was there. He had suspected she would be, because he'd noticed she gravitated toward books when she needed to feel safe, and the library was the most defensible room in this wing. She was standing at the south window, watching the darkness outside, her arms crossed over her chest. Lucien closed the door behind him. "Your name is Evelyn Marrow," he said. A long pause. She didn't turn around. "Your father was Adrian Marrow," he continued, "accountant for the Romano Syndicate. He disappeared a decade ago after assembling a financial record that would have dismantled half the criminal organizations on this coast." He paused. Those records were never found. She was very still. "I know who you are," he said. "I know why you were in this house, and I know why someone put their hands around your throat in my garden." She finally turned from the window. Her face was controlled. It had taken her a moment to get it there. He had caught the flicker before the control came down, but it was controlled now. "So what happens next?" she said. Flat. Not a question so much as an acknowledgement that something was about to be decided about her life, and she was waiting to hear what. "I want to know who attacked you." "I told the doctor I fell." "You told the doctor a story that a man who has run a criminal operation for 15 years immediately identified as a story." He held her eyes. "Who was it?" She studied him for a long moment, looking for the angle, looking for what he wanted from her that was the real reason he was in this room. He waited, because he understood the calculation she was running, and he understood that he was not going to be able to shortcut it. "One of Romano's men," she finally said. "I recognized him from when I was 14 before my father ran. He recognized me too. I don't know his name." "But they know you're here." "They knew I was here the moment he recognized me." She paused. "Which means Matteo Romano already knows." "Yes," Lucien said. "He does." Another silence. "If you're going to call him," she said carefully, "I'd rather you just tell me now." He looked at her for a long moment, at the bruises fading at her throat, at the controlled face and the uncrossable posture, and the eyes that had learned somewhere along a decade of running to read the room for threats and read it fast. He had made a decision before he walked into this room. He had simply been confirming it. "I'm not calling anyone," he said. She absorbed this. "I'm going to ask you one more question," he said, "and I need the truth." She waited. "The records your father compiled, the ledger, where is it?" The silence that followed was longer than the others. Outside the library windows, wind drove snow against the glass in slow rhythmic bursts, like something knocking for admission. "Somewhere only I can access it," she said finally. Lucien nodded once. That was enough for now. "Then you need to stay alive," he said, and turned for the door. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice came from directly behind him. She had crossed the room quickly and quietly in a way that most people couldn't have managed. He had heard her anyway. He always heard. He paused with his hand on the doorframe. "Somebody hurt a woman in my house," he said without turning around. "During my summit. Under my roof." He paused. "That's not something I can leave unaddressed." He left the room. He went directly to the dining hall where the remnants of the summit were concluding a post-dinner conversation that had been going on for 2 hours. And he stood at the head of the table and waited until every man in the room was looking at him. The room fell quiet with a speed that was almost comical, like someone had turned off a switch. Lucien looked around the table. "The woman who was found in the garden 2 nights ago," he said, "is under my protection." A beat of silence. Then Corrado Pauletti, who was 62 and had been running numbers since before Lucien was born, and who had apparently decided that his age gave him license to speak first, leaned forward. "Lucien, she's Marrow's daughter. You understand what that means. The ledger—" "If you say another word," Lucien said quietly, "I'll take it as a personal insult." Pauletti stopped. "She is under my protection," Lucien repeated. "That means she is a matter of this house, not a matter of Romano, not a matter of anyone in this room." He looked around the table slowly, making eye contact with each man in the deliberate, unhurried way that made people feel they were being measured. "Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." He said it in a tone that made taking it up with him directly sound like a genuinely terrible idea. Nobody moved. Then Salvatore Renna, who ran the Rhode Island operation and who had never been good at reading rooms, started to say something about the liability this created for everyone present, about the Romano family's established claim, about the necessity of— The sound was very loud in the confined space. Renna's glass of water tipped sideways and fell off the table. Everyone looked at Renna. Renna was slumped sideways in his chair, the expression on his face not quite anything anymore, a dark stain spreading through the collar of his shirt. The room was completely silent for 1 full second. Then Lucien set the gun on the table in front of him, as calmly as a man setting down a pen. He looked around the room. "Any other objections?" he said. No one spoke. The summit ended an hour later. Cars filed down the mountain road into the storm. No one said goodbye to the host. No one looked back at Black Hollow Estate as the darkness absorbed the procession of vehicles one by one. Lucien stood at the window of the main hall and watched them go. Marco was beside him. "Romano is going to call by morning," he said. "I know." "And when he does?" Lucien watched the last taillights disappear into the storm. "Tell him I'm unavailable," he said quietly, "and that I send my regards." Behind them, somewhere in the north wing, a door closed gently. The woman who had been found in the snow was still breathing, still alive, still here. And the man who had made that decision stood at the window and watched the blizzard consume the mountain and said nothing more. But in the morning, the first of Lucien's warehouses in Brooklyn was burning. And by the time the smoke reached the Catskills, 3 more were already gone. The first call came at 6:43 in the morning. Lucien was already awake. He had been awake since 4, sitting in the north study with the lights off and a cup of coffee gone cold on the desk beside him, reading the damage reports as they came in from Brooklyn. The warehouse on Fenwick Street had gone first. A clean burn, accelerant-based, professional. Then the loading facility on the waterfront. Then the cold storage unit his operation used for product that didn't exist on any official manifest. 3 buildings in 5 hours. No casualties, which meant it wasn't meant to be a massacre. It was meant to be a message. The message was received. Marco knocked once and entered without waiting, which was the arrangement. Knocking was courtesy, waiting was a waste of time. He held out the phone. "Romano," he said. Lucien looked at the phone for a moment. He picked it up. "Matteo," he said. The voice on the other end was younger than the name deserved. Matteo Romano was 31, which meant he had inherited the family at 21 and had spent the intervening decade trying to fill his father's absence with a specific kind of brutality that mistook volume for authority. His voice was smooth in the practiced way of men who had been coached on presentation. It made Lucien tired to listen to. 3 buildings, Lucien. Consider them a courtesy. A courtesy, Lucien repeated. A demonstration of restraint. A pause, calculated for effect. Give me the girl. I'll have someone there by noon. The arrangement between our families continues as normal. No more fires. Lucien looked at the cold coffee on his desk. The arrangement between our families, he said slowly, involves a mutual understanding about jurisdiction. My house is my jurisdiction. The woman in my house is my concern. The woman in your house is Adrian Marrow's daughter. She is Romano business. She is bleeding from injuries sustained under my roof. That makes her Black Hollow business. A beat of silence. When Matteo spoke again, the smoothness had thinned slightly, just enough to hear the thing underneath it. You're making this personal. You burned 3 of my buildings before 7 in the morning, Lucien said. You made it personal. He ended the call. Marco was still standing in the doorway, watching him with the expression of a man who had served under Lucien long enough to understand exactly what the expression on Lucien's face meant, and had enough professional self-preservation instinct to keep his own face carefully neutral. Start calling in everyone we have in the city, Lucien said. I want security doubled at every operation. Warehouses, ports, the restaurants, everything. That's going to cost. I know what it costs. Marco nodded. And get Hennessy. I want to know how she slept. The answer, when it came, was that she hadn't. Hennessy had checked on her at 5 and found her sitting upright in the chair in the corner of the medical room with her knees drawn to her chest and her eyes open in the dark. She had said she was fine. He had noted, in the clinical way Hennessy noted everything, that her hands had been shaking. Lucien went to the room at 7:30. He knocked, a different thing than Marco's knock, a deliberate slowness to it that gave her time, and opened the door. She was dressed. That was the first thing he noticed. She had found the clothing his staff had left for her and was wearing dark trousers and a gray sweater, and she was standing at the window with her arms crossed and her back to the door in a posture that could have been stubbornness or could have been the physical attitude of a person who had spent 10 years making sure they always knew where the exits were. You should have slept, he said. I was told by a man who shoots people at dinner parties that I should relax and rest. She turned from the window. Her face was sharp in the morning light. The bruising at her throat had deepened overnight. A yellow-green around the edges now, purple at the center. 3 buildings burned in Brooklyn. I heard your staff talking. He stepped into the room. That's being addressed. Romano doesn't warn people. He demonstrates. Her eyes were steady on him. Those fires were the opening, not the point. I know. He's going to keep going until you give me up, or until one of you is finished. She said it without drama, as a factual assessment. I've watched this pattern before. My father watched it from the inside. Lucien crossed to the small table by the window and set down the coffee he had brought. Sit down. I'd rather... Please sit down. Something in the way he said it, not a command, not quite, made her unfold slightly. She sat on the edge of the bed with the posture of someone who had never fully learned how to occupy furniture without being ready to leave it. He sat across from her. Tell me about the ledger, he said. She looked at him. Not what's in it, not where it is. Tell me what it would take to access it. A long pause. My father didn't trust banks, she said finally. He didn't trust digital storage. This was 15 years ago. He'd seen enough to know that anything digital could be found or destroyed. He built a physical system, encrypted documents split across multiple locations, none of which makes sense without the others. She stopped. And an access component that only exists with me. Biological? I'm not telling you that. Fair enough. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. If Romano takes you, can he access it? Not without me. Not without my cooperation. Her jaw tightened. Which is why they've always wanted me alive. Mostly. What changed? She looked at him steadily. The man who recognized me at your summit. He was sent by Matteo. not the old guard. Matteo runs differently than his father. He's decided that if he can't have the ledger, destroying it is the next best outcome. Lucien absorbed this. So the attack in the garden wasn't an attempt to capture you. It was an attempt to finish me. Her voice was flat. Which means someone told Matteo the ledger's locations are also in my head. And if that's the intelligence he has, he'd rather burn the information than let anyone else get to it first. Silence held the room for a moment. Outside, wind moved through the bare trees below the window, and Lucien could hear the sound of it, that specific hollow sound that large estates made in winter when they were working to keep the cold out. Who told him that? Lucien said. I don't know. Think harder. Her eyes sharpened. I said I don't know. You've been running for 10 years. You didn't do that by not being careful about who you trusted. He held her gaze. Someone gave Romano updated intelligence about what's in your head. That information came from somewhere recent. Who have you been in contact with in the last 6 months? The stillness that came over her was different from her usual control. This was the stillness of someone who had just run a calculation and arrived at an answer they didn't want. She didn't say anything. Evelyn, he said, don't call me that. Fast. Reflex. That's your name. That name is a target. She stood up abruptly, put her back to him, moved to the window again. Her arms went back across her chest. He could see the muscles at the back of her jaw working. He waited. There was a man in Prague, she said finally. Her voice was lower now. 8 months ago. He said he was a journalist, said he was investigating Romano for a European publication. He knew enough of the right details that She stopped. I talked to him, twice. I didn't tell him where the ledger was. I didn't tell him about the access component, but I confirmed it still existed. And that was enough, Lucien said. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. That was enough, she said. The day moved forward in the grinding way that days moved when the situation was bad and getting worse, and the only available activity was preparation. Lucien's men worked through the morning, reinforcing the estate's perimeter, repositioning surveillance, running checks on every member of the catering and domestic staff who had been present at the summit. Marco handled the operational details with his characteristic, efficient silence, appearing at Lucien's shoulder every 90 minutes with updates delivered in as few words as possible. 2 of the summit guests had already reached out through intermediaries, not to express concern, but to quietly establish that they were not involved and wished to be considered neutral parties. Lucien found this interesting. Neutral parties did not typically feel the need to announce their neutrality unless they had reason to suspect they might be suspected. He filed this information away. He found Evelyn in the library at noon. She had pulled 3 books from the shelves and wasn't reading any of them, which he suspected was the point. The books were arranged on the table in front of her, and she was staring at the far wall with the expression of someone engaged in a conversation that was happening entirely inside their own head. She didn't look up when he came in. I need you to be straight with me about something, he said. She looked up. The night you were found. You came through the service entrance. He sat across from her. You weren't assigned to this estate. The catering company has no record of a Serafina veil on their roster for this event. A beat. I know, she said. You got yourself inside deliberately. Yes. Why? She looked at the books on the table, then back at him. I've been tracking Romano's communications for 2 years. I knew about the summit. I knew the ledger's information would be most valuable if I could get it directly to multiple parties at once, parties who had their own reasons to want Romano finished. She paused. I needed to get inside the room. I needed to identify which of the men present might be willing to work against Romano in exchange for what my father built. Lucien sat back. You weren't running, he said slowly. You were hunting. She said nothing. And Romano's man made you before you could finish. Yes. He let out a long breath through his nose, looked at the ceiling. How long have you been planning this? 18 months. Alone. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in her face now that wasn't the controlled blankness, something more honest than that, or maybe just more exhausted. The kind of face a person made when they had been operating at full capacity for so long that the machinery was beginning to show through the surface. That was either very brave, he said, or very stupid. My father used to say those were the same thing. Your father ended up at the bottom of a river. Her expression didn't change, but something moved behind her eyes, quick and then controlled, like something surfacing and being pushed back down by force of habit. I know where my father ended up, she said quietly. He recognized the misstep immediately. I'm sorry, he said. That was accurate. She closed one of the books on the table, a precise movement. Don't apologize. I don't need that from you. What do you need? She looked at him. Help me finish what he started, she said. Not for power, not for money. I don't want anything from Romano's empire. I want it dismantled. Her voice was steady, and there was a quality to it that was different from anything she'd said before. Stripped of the wariness, or maybe so deeply committed to the thing being said that the wariness didn't have room. The network my father documented, politicians, judges, federal agents, people who are still operating, still protected, still burying bodies. She paused. I've been carrying this for 10 years. I need someone who has the reach to help me use it. Lucian studied her. And you decided that someone was me, he said. You're the only one in that room who I was reasonably confident wasn't already paid for by Romano. A reasonably low bar. In this industry, it's the highest bar available. He almost smiled. He didn't, but the muscles at the corner of his mouth moved in a way that someone paying close attention might have noticed. He was paying close attention. I'll think about it, he said. While you think, Matteo Romano is... I said I'll think about it. He stood. In the meantime, stay in this wing. Don't go near the outer rooms. Don't approach any staff you don't recognize. He paused at the door. And eat something. Hennessy says you haven't eaten since yesterday morning. He left before she could respond. The afternoon brought 3 more pieces of bad news in rapid succession. The first was from the waterfront, one of Lucien's port captains, a man named Dressler who had run the overnight operation for 6 years without incident, had been found that morning on a pier in Red Hook. Silver coins had been sewn into the skin of his palms. It was a signature, Romano's signature, old world and theatrical, and meant to send a specific message about what happened to men who worked for the wrong people. The second was from the city, a federal contact of Lucian's, a deputy marshal who had been on the informal payroll for 4 years, called through a clean line to say that there was unusual activity at the federal level, that someone had filed an emergency request to examine the Marrow case files that had been sealed since the original disappearance investigation. Someone was trying to locate the ledger through official channels. The third came from Marco at 6 in the evening, delivered in person, face-to-face, in the private study with the door closed. Dominic Hale, Marco said. Lucian looked up. Dominic Hale was Lucian's longest-serving underboss. 44 years old, 14 years in the organization, the last 7 in a position of substantial operational trust. He ran the financial architecture of Black Hollow's legitimate holdings, the development companies, the investment vehicles, the network of entities that transformed the organization's income into spreadsheets a tax attorney could review without losing color in his face. What about him? Lucian said. He made a call last night, after the summit guests left. Marco set a transcript on the desk. Encrypted line, but we broke it this morning. He called a number registered to a shell company in the Caymans. That company is 3 layers away from a Romano holding. The study was very quiet. Lucian looked at the transcript, read it again. In the call, Dominic Hale had confirmed that Lucien had the girl, had confirmed she was still alive, had mentioned, in clipped professional language that suggested the call was not the first of its kind, that Lucian appeared to have made a personal decision about her protection and that this decision could potentially be leveraged. 14 years. Lucian set the transcript down on the desk very carefully. Where is he now? He said. Downstairs, in the East office. He's been doing the quarterly accounts all afternoon. He doesn't know we have the transcript. Lucien nodded. He did not move for a long moment. He was thinking about 14 years. He was thinking about the particular mathematics of betrayal, how long it took to build the kind of trust that made a man useful, and how thoroughly a single phone call could incinerate it. He was thinking about the fact that Dominic Hale had access to the financial architecture of every legitimate holding Lucien controlled, and that if Romano had him, Romano had a map. He was also thinking about Evelyn in the library, 18 months of planning alone and a father at the bottom of a river. He stood up. "Don't let him leave the building," he said. He went down the stairs to the East office. Dominic Hale was at the desk, as advertised. A thick-set man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a spreadsheet open on the laptop in front of him. He looked up when Lucien came in and did what he always did, which was start to say something about the accounts, something procedural and professional. Lucien closed the door. Dominic stopped speaking. He looked at Lucien's face, and Lucien watched it happen. The moment the calculation ran and arrived at its answer, the fractional second when Dominic Hale understood that the thing he had been careful about, the thing he had thought he had managed with sufficient precision, had not been managed at all. The reading glasses slipped down from his forehead. "Lucien." "How long?" Lucien said. Silence. "How long, Dominic?" The man at the desk had the grace, at least, not to deny it. That was something. He took off his glasses entirely and set them on the desk with the specific, careful gesture of a man who understood that his hands should be visible and still. 8 months, he said. "What did you give them?" "Nothing operational. I swear to you. Nothing that put anyone in direct. What did you give them?" Dominic's jaw worked. "Financial projections, entity structures, nothing they could act on, nothing that—" "You told them she was here," Lucien said. "Last night." The man's mouth closed. "You told them I'd made a personal decision." Lucien's voice was very even. The evenness was the worst part of it. Dominic had heard Lucien raise his voice perhaps twice in 14 years, and what he understood about his employer's psychology was that the raised voice was never the thing to fear. "You used the word leveraged." "I thought—" Dominic stopped. "I was trying to—" "You were trying to protect your position," Lucien said. "You made an arrangement with Romano to protect yourself from what comes next. What you didn't think through is what comes next when I find out." The room was very quiet. Dominic Hale looked at the man standing in his doorway and understood, in the way that men in his position eventually came to understand these things, that the protection he had sought had not protected him at all, and that the thing he had most needed to consider was not the threat he was trying to avoid, but the one he was sitting across from. "Lucien," he said, "I have a family." Lucien looked at him for a long moment. "I know you do," he said. He stepped back into the corridor and called Marco. "The East office," he said quietly. "Handle it the way we discussed." He walked back upstairs. He stood at the window of the north study for a long time, watching darkness accumulate at the tree line, feeling the specific weight of a day that had gone from bad to worse to something that was no longer recoverable by ordinary means. 3 buildings in Brooklyn. A captain dead in Red Hook. A federal file request. 14 years turned inside out on the desk of the East office. And a woman 1 floor below him who had walked into the lion's den on purpose, with 18 months of planning and no backup, because she was the last person alive who believed the thing her father died for was worth finishing. He heard her in the corridor at 9 that evening. Her footsteps were distinctive, that quiet efficiency. And he stepped out of the study. She stopped when she saw him. She had a glass of water in one hand, and she was dressed for sleep, her dark hair loose, and for a moment in the corridor light she looked exhausted in a way she had been too controlled to show before, the careful architecture of her composure showing its fatigue. "Someone in my organization gave you up," he said. She absorbed this without visible reaction. "Is it handled?" "Yes." She looked at him. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough." He paused. "Romano knows more about my operations than I realized. I'm going to need to spend the next week repairing the exposure." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's because of me." "No. That's because a man I trusted for 14 years made a decision for money." He looked at her directly. "That's his failure, not yours." She stood in the corridor holding her glass of water, and he stood in the doorway of his study, and between them was all of it. The fires and the dead captain and the transcript and the ledger and 10 years of a woman running through Europe under different names because her father had tried to do the right thing and paid for it in the specific currency that men in this world paid for that kind of decision. I want to help with the repairs, she said. You're not. I know how Romano's financial architecture works, she said. I've been studying it for 2 years. If they've mapped your legitimate holdings, I can help you identify where the exposure is. She held his gaze. Let me help. I didn't come here to be kept in a room. He studied her. Tomorrow morning, he said. We'll work on it together. She nodded, turned to go back to her room. Evelyn, he said. She turned back. You said your father taught you to fight, he said. He taught you well. Something moved in her face, old grief, and something alongside it that wasn't quite gratitude but lived in the same neighborhood. She didn't say anything. She turned and went back to her room and closed the door softly. Lucien stood in the corridor alone. He went back into the study. He pulled out the list of everything Dominic Hale had accessed in the past 8 months. He started reading. He was 3 pages in when Marco appeared in the doorway with the expression he wore when the news was the kind that required sitting down to receive it. We have a problem, Marco said, bigger than the accounts. Lucien looked up. Rena's people, Marco said. The man you shot at the dinner. His organization is claiming it was unprovoked. They're saying they want to sit down. He paused. They've already talked to Romano. They're aligning. Lucien set down the papers. How many of Rena's men? 60. Maybe more. They're well-funded and they're angry. Marco crossed his arms. And that's not the worst of it. He paused one more beat. The specific pause of a man choosing how to deliver information that was going to significantly alter the evening. Caruso called. The 3 months he owes you? He's been funneling it to Romano instead. Has been since October. He says he's backing Matteo in whatever comes next. The study was very quiet. Lucien sat back in his chair. He did the arithmetic. Rena's 60 men aligned with Romano. Caruso's network and money, backing Matteo. The exposure in his own legitimate holdings courtesy of Dominic Hale's 8-month arrangement. The dead captain, the federal file request, the fires in Brooklyn, and one woman sleeping down the hall carrying the only weapon that could end all of it, if she trusted him enough to use it, and if they survived long enough to do so. He looked at Marco. How many of our people can we count on without question, he said. Marco thought about it honestly, which Lucien valued. 30, maybe 35 if we call in the Boston crew. Against 60, plus Romano's full apparatus. Get them here, Lucien said. All of them. By morning. Marco left. Lucien sat alone in the study with the papers from Dominic Hale's file spread across his desk, and the weight of what the next weeks were going to cost settling across his shoulders like something physical. He was not afraid. He had not been afraid of opposition in a very long time, but he was sober about the mathematics. He picked up his phone. He called a number he had not called in 3 years. A man in Washington who owed him a debt of the kind that didn't appear in financial records. A man who had access to a specific kind of federal machinery. The phone rang 4 times, picked up. It's Devereaux, Lucien said. I need a conversation about the Marrow case files. Tonight, if possible. He paused. Yes, all of them. I need to know who filed the emergency access request this morning, and I need to know before the request is processed. He listened. I understand the risk, he said. I also understand what I did for you in 2019, and I know you understand it too. Another pause. Good, Lucien said. I'll expect the call. He ended it. He set the phone on the desk. Across the estate, somewhere in the east wing, a door banged against its frame in a gust of wind off the mountain. A sound like something trying to get in, or trying to get out. The old house working against the cold the way it always had, indifferent to what was happening inside its walls. And then his phone lit up again. Not the Washington number. An unknown number. He answered it. A voice he recognized immediately. Matteo Romano, but different from the morning call. Stripped of the smoothness. Something underneath it now that was either anger or excitement, and in Lucien's experience, those two things lived so close together in men like Matteo that the distinction rarely mattered. "I know about Hale," Matteo said, "and I know you dealt with him, which means you know how deep the exposure goes." A pause. "It's not just the legitimate holdings, Lucian. It goes further than that. You want to know how much further? You bring me the girl by midnight tomorrow." Lucien said nothing. "She's not worth this," Matteo said. "No woman is worth what's coming. You've run this coast for 15 years, and you've done it by being smarter than everyone in the room. Be smart now. Give her to me, and we close this tonight." Lucien held the phone against his ear and looked at the study door, the closed door behind which the corridor led to the room where Evelyn Marrow was sleeping, or trying to, or sitting in the dark with her arms around her knees the way Hennessy had found her at 5 in the morning. He thought about what Matteo had said. He thought about how much he knew about the exposure in his own organization. He thought about 35 men against 60, plus Romano's full reach. He thought about a girl in the snow. "No," he said. Dead silence on the line. "Last chance," Matteo said. "Go to hell, Matteo." He ended the call. He sat in the quiet of his study with the phone on the desk and the papers spread around him and the cold pressing against the windows from outside, and he felt the decision settle into place the way decisions settled when they were final. Not light, not clean, but solid. The kind of thing you could put your weight on even when the ground around it was giving way in every direction. Lucien sat with the phone face down on the desk and did not move for a long time. The study had that particular quality of silence that large houses develop in the deep hours of winter nights. Not quiet exactly, but pressurized, like the walls were holding something back. He could hear the heating system working. He could hear wind against the north face of the estate. He could hear, distantly, the sound of his own breathing, which was slower and more controlled than the situation probably warranted. He pulled the papers back toward him. He was looking for the shape of the exposure Matteo had referenced. Dominic Hale's financial access had been substantial, but theoretically contained: the legitimate holdings, the investment vehicles, the shell architecture. What Matteo had said was that it went further. That phrase had a specific weight to it, the weight of a man who knew something and was deciding how much of that knowledge to deploy as leverage versus how much to keep back. Lucien understood leverage. He had used it for 15 years. He understood that Matteo's call had not been a threat. It had been a demonstration, a proof of concept. "I have something you don't know about yet, and I can make your night significantly worse before morning if I choose to." The question was what? He called Marco back into the study at 11, and they worked through the Hale materials side by side for 2 hours, cross-referencing the access logs against the actual operational files, mapping the timeline of what Dominic had seen and when. It was painstaking, and it was necessary, and by 1 in the morning they had identified 3 areas of concern, 2 manageable, 1 significantly less so. The significantly less manageable one involved a federal asset, not the deputy marshal, who was contained and whose arrangement was clean. Something older. A file that Dominic had accessed 14 months ago, well before his Romano arrangement according to the timeline, which meant the access had a different origin. The file related to a federal informant inside Lucien's organization, an informant whose existence Lucien had been aware of for 9 months and had managed carefully, feeding specific information and starving others, the standard approach when you knew the wire was in the room. But the file Dominic had accessed was not the current informant file. It was a sealed file from 7 years ago. Lucien looked at it for a long time. "Pull everything we have on the Carver operation," he said. 2017, all of it. Marco left. Lucien sat alone. The Carver operation in 2017 had been a federal task force targeting Northeast organized crime, a 2-year investigation that had ended without indictments because key evidence had been deemed inadmissible. At the time, Lucien had considered it a fortunate outcome and had not examined it too carefully, because in his experience, fortunate outcomes were best accepted without excessive scrutiny. He was beginning to suspect that scrutiny had been overdue. Marco returned at 1:45 with the files. They read through them together. By 2:30, Lucien understood. The Carver operation had not failed due to inadmissible evidence. The evidence had been made inadmissible, deliberately. Through a specific legal intervention by a federal judge who had, according to the documents now on Lucian's desk, received 2 wire transfers totaling $800,000 in the 6 months prior to the evidentiary ruling. The transfers originated from a Romano holding, but the account that coordinated the transfers, the account that had managed the communication between Romano's money and the judge's offshore vehicle, had been managed by a specific financial architect operating under a corporate identity that Lucian now recognized. It was one of Dominic Hale's entities. Lucian set the paper down. He sat back. Dominic Hale had not been recruited by Romano 8 months ago. He had been Romano's man for 7 years, possibly longer. The 8 months was the duration of his active reporting on Evelyn's situation, a specific tasking layered on top of an arrangement that had existed since before Lucian knew Evelyn Marrow existed. 7 years. He thought about every conversation in those 7 years, every strategic decision Dominic had been present for, every financial structure he had built, every legitimate holding he had touched. He thought about how much of what he believed was secure was actually exposed. He thought about the $200 million in legitimate assets that Dominic had managed for the past 4 years. He picked up his phone and called the forensic accountant he kept on retainer in Boston, a woman named Price, who answered at any hour and who charged accordingly, and who had never once asked him a question that wasn't directly relevant to the numbers. "I need a full audit of the Devereaux Holdings portfolio," he said. "Every entity Dominic Hale touched. I need it started tonight, and I need preliminary findings by morning." He told her what he suspected. There was a pause on her end that lasted longer than her pauses usually did. "If that's accurate," she said carefully, "we're not talking about exposure. We're talking about structural compromise." "I know," he said. "Lucien, if he's been moving money for Romano through your legitimate entities for 7 years, the federal exposure alone. I know, Price. Start the audit." He ended the call. He stood up, moved to the window, pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and looked out at the darkness of the mountain and the snow that was falling again, lighter than before. A soft, steady fall that was somehow worse than the blizzard had been, because it was quiet and relentless and it covered everything. He had built Black Hollow over 15 years. He had been meticulous. He had been careful in ways that most men in his position never bothered to be, because he understood that what separated the men who lasted from the men who didn't was not strength or ruthlessness. The industry produced both in abundance, but the capacity for patience and precision applied consistently over long periods of time. And for 7 years, a man he had given that trust to had been sitting inside his house, at his table, with access to his architecture, and had been a door left open. He stayed at the window until 3. Then he went to sleep for 3 hours, because he had learned long ago that sleep-deprived decision-making was more dangerous than any external threat. He was awake again at 6. Evelyn was in the kitchen when he came down. She had found the coffee and made a full pot and was standing at the counter with both hands wrapped around a mug, looking at the window above the sink where the morning was coming in gray and cold. She looked up when he entered, read his face. "Bad night," she said. It wasn't a question. Educational. He poured himself coffee, stood on the other side of the kitchen island. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." She set her mug down. "When your father built the ledger," he said, "the financial documentation, the corruption network, was there material in it that implicated federal judges?" Something shifted in her expression. "Yes." "How many?" "3 that I know of. Possibly more. I haven't been through all of it. There were files I haven't been able to access yet because some of the physical components are in locations I haven't been able to reach safely." She paused. "Why?" "Because I think Romano has been using a federal judge to manage his legal exposure for at least 7 years, and I think that judge may be in your father's files." He set his coffee down. "Which means if we move against Romano using that material, we need to know who on the federal bench is compromised before we start. Otherwise, we hand the evidence to the wrong people and it disappears." She absorbed this without moving. "You're saying we need to read the ledger before we use it." "I'm saying we need to identify which parts of it are immediately actionable and which parts are traps." She looked at him for a long moment. I can access the first component, the one I have with me. She paused. But the other components, two of them are in deposit boxes in different cities. I'd need to travel. Not yet, he said. Not until we understand the full picture here. She picked up her mug again, drank, set it down. The judge's name, she said. In my father's files. I've seen reference to a federal judge in the financial routing records. I don't remember the name, but I remember the amounts. 800,000 over 6 months. She paused. Sound familiar? He looked at her. 2017, she said, Bob. The Carver Task Force. He was quiet for a moment. You knew about that. I've been reading Romano's financial patterns for 2 years. That routing sequence was in 3 separate transaction records I accessed. She met his eyes. I didn't know it connected to you specifically. I knew it was someone Romano had protected. I didn't know who. He nodded, slowly. The judge's name, he said. If it's in your access component, I'll find it. She straightened up. Give me 2 hours. She worked in the library while Lucien managed the morning's operational fallout. Price called at 8 with preliminary audit findings that confirmed his worst assessment. Marco reported that the Boston crew was en route and would arrive by afternoon, and a contact at the waterfront confirmed that Romano's people had been asking questions at the port about Lucien's shipping arrangements with a specificity that suggested they had a detailed map. Hale's map. 7 years of it. At 10, Marco appeared in the study doorway with an expression that Lucien had learned to read over 11 years of working together. It was the expression Marco wore when the news was the kind that required him to choose his words with particular care. What? Lucien said. The Washington contact called back, Marco said, about the Marrow case file request. Who filed it? Marco looked at him steadily. The request came from inside the DOJ Organized Crime Division. He paused. Filed under a sealed warrant. The name on the warrant is Agent Curtis Vane. The name landed in the room without immediate weight. Lucien processed it for a moment. I don't know that name, he said. No, Marco said, but she might. Lucien went to the library. Evelyn was at the table with a small fireproof case open in front of her. The access component, which turned out to be a series of photographic negatives and a handwritten cipher key in her father's handwriting, held together with a rubber band that had aged to brittleness. She was working through them methodically, cross-referencing against a notation system she was reconstructing from memory. She looked up when he came in. Curtis Vane, he said. She went very still. The stillness was different from her usual control. This was the stillness of a person who had just heard a sound that the body recognized before the mind caught up. The primal freeze, the held breath. Where did you hear that name, she said. DOJ filed an emergency access request on your father's case files this morning. It was filed under a sealed warrant by an agent named Curtis Vane. He watched her face. Who is he? She set down the photograph she was holding. She set it down with the careful precision of someone managing the distance between their hands and a hard surface very deliberately, because if they didn't manage it deliberately, the thing in their hands was going to hit the table harder than intended. He's the reason my father is dead, she said. The library was quiet. Explain, Lucien said. She pressed both hands flat on the table, looked at them, then looked up. Curtis Vane was the FBI handler assigned to my father when he started copying the Romano files. My father didn't go to the FBI voluntarily. Vane recruited him, spent 8 months building a relationship with him, convinced him that the Bureau could protect him, protect us, protect the evidence. Her voice was flat and controlled, and the flatness was doing a lot of work. When Romano found out my father was talking, Vane was the only person outside our family who knew where we were living, the only person who knew my father's timeline for delivering the files. Lucien was very still. My father had a meet scheduled with Vane the night he disappeared, she said. He drove to that meet. He never drove back. She paused. I was 14. My mother had already died. A neighbor got me out of the apartment before Romano's men came for me. I had 40 minutes and a backpack. She looked at the cipher key in her father's handwriting. Vane filed a report saying my father had gotten cold feet and run with the evidence. He closed the file as a defection, marked it inactive. He handed your father to Romano, Lucien said. He gave Romano the location and the timeline, and then he wrote a report that made sure no one looked too hard at what happened afterward. Her jaw tightened. I've known it for years. I couldn't prove it. The evidence is in the ledger. There are transaction records showing payments from a Romano account to a personal vehicle registered to a federal employee with Vane's badge number. My father documented everything. She paused. Including his own handler. Lucien absorbed the full geometry of it. Curtis Vane, FBI agent, on Romano's payroll for at minimum 10 years, currently filing federal warrant requests to access the Marrow files, the files that contain the documentation of his own corruption. He's trying to get to the evidence before you can use it, Lucien said. He's been trying for 10 years. She looked at him directly. And now he knows I'm alive and that I'm here, which means he knows the ledger is active, which means the warrant request isn't just about the files. Her voice dropped slightly. He needs me gone, Lucien. Not captured. Gone. Because as long as I'm alive, the transaction records that destroy him are accessible. Lucien turned away from her, moved to the window, stood there. He was revising his entire understanding of the situation's geometry. Romano was the visible threat. The fires, the dead captain, the 60 men aligned with Rena. But underneath Romano was something more dangerous because it wore a federal badge and had access to legal machinery and had been operating in the dark for 10 years without anyone looking directly at it. Vane had buried the Marrow case once. He had the institutional access to do it again. And if Vane and Romano were coordinating, if the federal access request was being run in parallel with Romano's operational pressure, then the threat to Evelyn was not just the men outside the gates. It was the architecture of the law itself, corrupted from the inside. He turned back. How close are you to reconstructing the cipher? He said. An hour, maybe 2. She paused. The judge's name will be in the first set of records, and Vane's payment documentation. Can you photograph the negatives and transmit the images securely? If you have a secure channel. I have a federal prosecutor in the Southern District, he said. Clean, not connected to Romano or the Organized Crime Division. He works financial fraud. I've never used him for anything that touched organized crime, which means his name won't appear in anything Hale passed to Romano. He paused. If we can get him authenticated copies of the payment records tonight, he has the authority to file an emergency protective order that would freeze the warrant request and flag Vane's activities for internal review. She was quiet for a moment. That buys time. That buys time, he confirmed. It's not resolution, but it gets Vane off the immediate board. And Romano. Romano is a different problem. He looked at her. Finish the cipher. He left her to it. He found Marco in the corridor. I need everything we have on a federal agent named Curtis Vane, he said. FBI, Organized Crime Division, been active at least 10 years. Cross-reference him against any Romano-connected financial activity you can find through our banking contacts. Marco wrote the name. Time frame. Yesterday. He went back to the study, called Price, gave her Vane's name and asked her to run the badge number against the transaction record she was auditing from the Hale materials. Then he sat back. He thought about the prosecutor in the Southern District. He thought about the risk of using that channel. It was clean, but using it meant putting himself into a federal context, meant creating a record of contact that could be examined later. It was not a comfortable position, but the alternative was letting Vane process his warrant, access the sealed files, and engineer the disappearance of the evidence before it could be used. He picked up the phone. He was mid-dial when the first alarm went off. Not the perimeter alarm, the internal one. The motion sensors in the east wing. He was on his feet before the second alarm sounded. He went into the corridor with his weapon drawn and moved toward the east wing with the particular focused speed of a man who had cleared rooms before and knew how to do it without announcing himself. Behind him, he could hear Marco shouting orders to the security team, heard feet on the stairs, heard the specific organized chaos of a security response deploying. The east wing was empty. He cleared 3 rooms. The 4th room, the secondary server room where the estate's surveillance and communications infrastructure was housed, had its door standing open. He went in. The room was intact. Nothing broken. Nothing visibly disturbed. But the primary communications terminal was lit up with a sequence he didn't recognize, and on the secondary monitor, the one that displayed active connection status, a data transfer was completing its final percentage. He got to the terminal in 3 strides. 53 gigabytes. Completed. External destination. He looked at the timestamp. The transfer had started 42 minutes ago, while he was in the kitchen, while he was in the library, while the estate was doing what it always did in the mornings, operating on routine. He looked at the user authentication on the transfer log. The credentials used were his own, his personal access codes. He stood in the server room with the completed transfer on the screen and the cold knowledge of it moving through him like something physical, like the cold outside had found a way in after all. Someone had used his personal credentials, someone who had access to them. He went through the list in his head. 3 people had access to his personal authentication codes. Marco, Price, and Dominic Hale, who had needed them 4 years ago for a specific financial filing and who Lucian had never revoked because revoking access required acknowledging the possibility that it would be needed. Hale was dealt with. Hale was no longer a factor, but Hale's access hadn't died with Hale. Because Hale had passed those credentials on, Lucian turned and walked back to the study and called the destination analysis on the transfer. Marco could run the IP trace in 20 minutes. He sat at his desk and waited and felt the shape of the morning rearranging itself around him into something he had not prepared for. Marco came back in 12 minutes. The transfer destination, he said. It routed through 3 proxy servers. We cracked the last hop. He paused. It went to a server registered to a security contractor based in Virginia. Another pause. The contractor's federal client list is public record. Their primary client is the FBI, Lucian said. The FBI, Marco confirmed. Vane had not just filed a warrant request. Vane had already been inside. While Lucian was reading audit files and drinking coffee and talking to Evelyn about cipher keys, someone using credentials that traced back to Dominic Hale's legacy access had pulled 53 gigabytes of Black Hollow's operational data and sent it to a federal server registered to Curtis Vane's division. Everything they had been working to protect, everything they had been preparing to use, gone before they could deploy it. Lucien stood up. He walked to the library. Evelyn looked up when he came through the door. She read his face in the specific way she had, that 3-second assessment, exits, and threats and emotional register, all of it processed and categorized before he had crossed the threshold. What happened? She said. Vane already has everything, he said. He ran a data pull through legacy credentials 30 minutes ago, 53 gigabytes of our operational files, communications, financial records, personnel. Everything we were going to use to build the case is now sitting on a federal server that Vane controls. She stood up. The cipher key fell from the table. She didn't look at it. He has the ability to shape what gets reviewed, Lucien said. He can bury the payment records, he can bury his own name. He can take the Romano financial documentation and file it in a way that initiates an investigation. He paused. Of me. The full weight of it settled in the room between them. Vane didn't need to kill the evidence, he could weaponize it. Take the Romano financial records, which were thoroughly entangled with Lucian's legitimate holdings courtesy of 7 years of Dominic Hale, and present them to a grand jury in a way that made Lucian the primary subject of investigation rather than Romano. Use the corruption to bury the man who was trying to expose it. It was elegant. Lucian could acknowledge that even now. The negatives, he said. Your access component. Does Vane know it exists? He knows my father built a failsafe. He doesn't know the form it takes. She looked at the fireproof case on the table. He knows I'm the access point, which is why he needs me gone. But the negatives themselves. Physical copies of the original transaction records. Not digital, not transmissible. Lucien looked at the case. That's the only thing that doesn't exist on a server Vane controls. She understood immediately. If we can get the physical documentation to your prosecutor tonight, before Vane can file his version of events, yes. He moved to the table. How much more do you need? I have the judge's name, she said. And I have the Vane payment records. 3 transactions, dates, amounts, the Romano account of origin. She held up a photograph, a negative image, her father's handwriting visible in the margin notations. This is enough to open an investigation that Vane can't control, enough to flag him to the DOJ Inspector General. If it gets there, Lucian said. If it gets there, she agreed. He looked at her. She was standing with the photograph in her hand and the cipher key on the floor and the controlled face that wasn't quite as controlled as usual, the exhaustion showing through the architecture of it in ways it hadn't before. I need to get you out of this estate, he said. Tonight. She looked at him without surprise. She had already been running the math. Romano's perimeter. We go before they tighten it. He checked his watch. I need 3 hours to set up a route and arrange the handoff with the prosecutor. He paused. Pack what you need to carry, nothing heavy. She nodded. Started to reach for the fireproof case. Evelyn, he said. She stopped. He stood in the library doorway, and for a moment, a brief moment, the kind that didn't announce itself and didn't last long enough to be examined, he looked at her the way a man looked at something he understood he might not be looking at much longer. Something in that look that was not strategic, not calculated, something considerably less comfortable than either. We're going to finish this, he said. She held his eyes. My father said the same thing, she said quietly. It was not meant as a wound. It landed as one anyway. He left the room. He was halfway down the corridor when Marco's voice came through the radio, clipped and urgent, with the specific frequency shift that meant the news was immediate and bad. North perimeter. We have vehicles. Multiple. Coming up the mountain road. Lucian stopped walking. How many? He said into the radio. 6 vehicles, at least. A pause filled with static and background sound. Lucien, they're not slowing down. He looked back toward the library. He looked toward the front of the estate. He thought about the 53 gigabytes on Vane's server. He thought about the negatives in the fireproof case. He thought about 35 men and 6 vehicles coming up the mountain road in the dark. He thought about a woman in the snow, barely breathing, one hand wrapped around a silver pendant. And the thing that had been cold in him for 15 years, the precise, patient, calculating cold that had built Black Hollow and buried its enemies and survived everything the Underworld had directed at it, that cold cracked, not broke, cracked, like ice under pressure. Like something that had been frozen long enough deciding, finally, that it was done being cold. Hold the north gate, Lucian said into the radio. Do not engage until I give the order. He was already moving. He went back to the library in 8 strides, pushed through the door, and crossed to the table where Evelyn stood with the fireproof case already latched in her hand. She had heard the radio. She had the photograph negatives secured and the cipher key folded inside the case, and she was wearing her coat. She had been ready before he came back for her. That registered somewhere. How many exits does this building have that they won't know about, she said. 2. The tunnel under the east foundation comes out 200 yards into the tree line, and the service elevator in the north kitchen that drops to the maintenance level. There's a crawl access to the generator housing from there. He looked at her. The tunnel is faster, but it's a straight line. If they have anyone positioned in the trees, they do, she said. 6 vehicles means they anticipated a perimeter run. They'll have the tree line covered. Generator housing, then. He took her arm, not roughly, but with the directed pressure of a man moving toward a specific outcome at speed. Stay behind me. Don't stop moving regardless of what you hear. If I go down, you're not going down. If I go down, he repeated firmly, you take the case and you run. You don't look back. You get to the prosecutor. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Don't go down then, she said. They moved. The estate was in controlled chaos, not panic because Lucien's people were trained past panic, but the specific high-velocity efficiency of a security operation responding to an imminent breach. Men moved through corridors in pairs, weapons out, communications clipped and professional through the radio network. Marco's voice was everywhere, calm and precise, coordinating the defensive response with the efficiency of a man who had run these drills enough times that the real thing was just a drill with higher stakes. Lucien moved Evelyn through the north corridor, past the coat room, through the kitchen. One of his men, Garrett, a former Army Ranger who had been with the organization for 4 years, fell in behind them without being told, covering their six with a short-barreled rifle and the particular stillness of a man who had been in actual combat and knew the difference between alertness and anxiety. They reached the north kitchen. Through the windows above the sink, Lucien could see the front approach. Headlights on the mountain road, 6 sets of them, spreading out as the vehicles reached the estate's outer wall. They were deploying in a fan pattern, coordinated, professional, not Romano's usual style. Romano used numbers and aggression. This was tactical. This was planned with a different kind of mind. "That's not just Romano's people," Lucien said. Evelyn was already at the window beside him. She looked at the headlight pattern. Something in her face tightened. "Vane," she said. "He has private contractors he uses. Off-book. He used them in Prague. That's how I know the operational signature." She turned from the window. "This isn't a kidnapping attempt. This is a termination operation." Lucien processed this in approximately 1 second. If Vane was running this alongside Romano, if federal resources were being deployed through private contractors to provide deniability, then this was not a situation that ended with negotiation or with Lucien shooting the right person. This was a situation that ended with everyone inside this building either dead or in custody, and the distinction between those two outcomes would be managed by Curtis Vane from a server room in Virginia. "The generator housing," he said. "Now." They went through the service door into the utility corridor, down the stairs to the maintenance level, and through the low concrete passage to the generator housing. The space smelled of diesel and cold metal, and the particular closed-air smell of spaces that existed to serve the building rather than the people inside it. Emergency lighting threw everything in yellow-white. Garrett stayed at the passage entrance while Lucien moved to the exterior access panel on the east wall of the generator housing, a steel hatch designed for maintenance access to the exterior generator array, opening to a narrow passage between the estate's outer wall and the generator housing itself. He got the hatch open. Cold air drove in immediately, carrying snow. The passage was barely shoulder width, 6 feet of exposed ground between the housing and the outer wall's maintenance gate, which opened to a service road that ran along the estate's eastern edge before connecting to the secondary mountain road 2 miles down. "The service road is not going to be clean," he said. "I know." He looked at her. In the emergency lighting, her face was all angles and shadow, and her eyes had the quality he had noticed the first time she had looked at him without fear. The quality of someone who had already done the calculation and accepted the result. "You've done this before," he said. "Run from a place that was being closed down." "More times than I want to count." She held the fireproof case against her chest. "I'm better at it than I look." "You look extremely capable," he said. It came out differently than it was intended. She registered it, a fractional shift in her expression, there and gone. "Stay low and stay with me," he said. "Go." They went through the hatch. The cold was immediate and total. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself but simply arrived, occupying every breath and every exposed surface at once. Snow had drifted against the outer wall, and they moved through it above the knee in places. Lucien ahead, and Evelyn a step behind with Garrett covering their exit from the hatch. They reached the maintenance gate. The lock was a keypad. Lucien hit the 6-digit code without slowing, and the gate swung inward. They moved through. Behind them, from the direction of the front of the estate, they heard it begin. The first burst of gunfire was short and disciplined. Not the opening of a firefight, but the sound of a perimeter being tested, pressure being applied to a specific point to see how it responded. Then a second burst, longer. Then the sound of Marco's voice through Lucien's earpiece, steady and operational. "North gate, breach attempt, holding, west wall contact, 2 men down, ours are contained." 2 men down. Lucien kept moving. The service road was unplowed and snow-covered, which meant it was slower but also meant there were no tire tracks to follow. He moved at a fast walk. Running in knee-deep snow was worse than the measured fast walk, and he needed his breathing controlled. Evelyn matched his pace precisely, her footfalls in the spaces his feet had already compressed. The secondary road was 8 minutes away at this pace. At the 5-minute mark, Garrett's voice came through the earpiece. Contact behind us. 2 on foot, coming through the maintenance gate. Lucian didn't stop. Can you hold them? For a while. Hold them. He reached back and took Evelyn's hand without thinking about it. Just the practical necessity of moving faster over uneven ground in the dark, and pulled her forward as the tree line opened onto the wider service road. A vehicle was parked at the service road intersection, not one of his. A dark SUV, engine running, no lights. The driver's window was down and the man behind it had a weapon on the frame of the door, and it was pointed directly at Lucian's chest from 30 feet away. Everything stopped. Snow fell in the stillness between them. Lucian's weapon was out but not raised. He had gone for it the moment he saw the vehicle, but the geometry was wrong. 30 feet, head on. The man had already had his shot lined up. Then the man said, "Devereaux." Not a question, a confirmation. He lowered the weapon. "Price sent me," he said. Lucian looked at him. The man was mid-40s, crew cut, the physical build of someone who had been in a professional capacity involving physical fitness for a long time and had not stopped when the capacity ended. He reached through the window and held up a phone. On the screen was a text from Price's number, a confirmation code that Lucian had established with her years ago for exactly this kind of verification need. "Get in," the man said. Lucian looked at Evelyn. She was already moving toward the vehicle. They got in. The SUV moved immediately. Not fast, not reckless, but with the deliberate speed of a driver who knew how to move without drawing attention on a mountain road at 3 in the morning. Lucian was in the front passenger seat with his weapon in his lap. Evelyn was in the back with the fireproof case. "Name," Lucian said. "Aldrich. I work for Price. She pulled me when the audit started flagging federal activity." He kept his eyes on the road. "She figured you might need an exit that wasn't on any record your operation owns." "Where are we going?" "Albany. Price has the prosecutor meeting set for 6 a.m. She pulled him out of bed personally." Aldrich paused. "She also flagged the DOJ Inspector General's office. Anonymous tip, pointing to the Vane warrant request. The IG's office has a duty officer. It's moving." Lucian looked at the side mirror. The estate was already invisible behind the tree line, but he could see the faint orange-white flicker of something burning above the ridge. Not the building. The color was wrong, too focused. A vehicle. Or the generator housing. He thought about Marco. About Garrett. About 35 men holding 6 vehicles in a termination operation. He pulled up the radio. "Marco." Static. Then, "Here. How are you holding?" A pause that was slightly longer than Lucian preferred. "We're holding. Lost Garrett. Romano's people are trying to push through the west wall, but they haven't broken the line." Another pause. "The contractors, Lucian, they're better than Romano's regulars. They're working coordinated." "I know. Hold the structure. Don't chase anyone outside the perimeter. Stay inside and make them come to you." He paused. "I'll be back before morning." "Copy." He lowered the radio. Evelyn was leaning forward from the back seat, her forearms on the back of his headrest. Close enough that he could hear her breathing, controlled, slower than the situation warranted, the deliberate respiratory control of someone who had trained themselves past panic years ago. "Garrett?" she said quietly. "Yes." She said nothing more. Sat back. The road down the mountain was dark and winding, and Aldrich drove it with familiarity that suggested he had driven it before, or had studied it carefully before tonight, which amounted to the same level of preparation. The SUV's headlights cut through the falling snow in white cones that showed 30 feet of road and nothing else. They were 7 minutes down the mountain when the second vehicle appeared behind them. Not following. It had been waiting on a pull-off on the inside of a curve, engine off, dark. It pulled out behind them and lit up immediately, high beams flooding the SUV's interior. Aldrich's jaw tightened. "We've got a tail." "I see it." Lucian checked the side mirror. One vehicle. Closing distance fast. "How far to the main road?" 4 minutes. "They'll catch us in 2. The vehicle behind them accelerated. A dark pickup, heavy, the kind of build that was designed to be used as a ram. Lucian understood the tactic immediately. Mountain road, no guardrail on the outer edge in several stretches, a vehicle significantly heavier than theirs. They didn't need weapons. They needed to push them off the road. "Evelyn," he said, "get down." Get down." She dropped below the level of the seat back. Aldrich said, "I'm going to need you to—" And then the pickup hit them from behind. The impact was a full-body thing, not a tap, a deliberate strike at speed that drove the SUV forward and sideways, the rear end swinging toward the outer edge of the road. Aldrich caught it, corrected, both hands hard on the wheel with the controlled violence of a man fighting physics. Lucian's window was down before the SU-5 had fully straightened. He leaned out into the snow-driven air and fired twice at the pickup's front left tire. The second shot connected. The pickup shuddered, the blowout at speed creating exactly the kind of instability on a mountain road that the driver had been trying to create for them. The vehicle pulled hard left, overcorrected, and the rear end came around. It hit the rock face of the inner mountain wall and stopped. Aldrich drove. Nobody spoke for a full minute. Then Evelyn's voice from the back. "You okay?" "Yes," Lucian said. He pulled his arm back inside. His shoulder was wet from the snow, and his ears were ringing from the shots in the confined air. He checked the mirror. The pickup was stopped, partially blocking the road. No movement visible. He rolled up the window. 4 minutes, Aldrich said. His voice was level. "We're almost to the main road." They reached it. The transition from mountain road to state highway was the transition from darkness to the ambient light of the valley. Distant town lights, the gray-orange glow of a clear highway, the particular visual relief of a road with lanes and painted lines, and the implied civilization of infrastructure. Aldrich drove north toward Albany without exceeding the speed limit. Lucian called Marco again at the 40-minute mark. "Romano's people are pulling back," Marco said. He sounded different. The operational steadiness was still there, but underneath it was the specific texture of a voice that had been running on adrenaline for hours and was beginning to feel the depletion. "The contractors broke contact 20 minutes ago. Clean withdrawal. They didn't leave anything." "Casualties?" A pause. 4, Marco said, "including Garrett." Another pause. 6 wounded, none critical. Lucien closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "Secure the estate," he said. "Get medical in for the wounded. Nobody leaves the property until I'm back." "Copy." He ended the call. The interior of the SUV was quiet. Aldrich drove. Snow moved in horizontal streams across the highway and the SUV's lights, not falling so much as traveling, the kind of snow that was going somewhere with purpose. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said from the back seat. "About your men." He turned and looked at her. She was sitting upright now, the fireproof case on her lap, her dark hair still carrying snow that was melting in the vehicle's warmth. Her face was the most unguarded he had seen it, not vulnerable, not soft, but stripped of the strategic architecture. Just a person, in a car, carrying the weight of what other people had paid for her survival. "This isn't your fault," he said. "You said that about Hale." "And I meant it then, too." He held her eyes. "None of what Romano and Vane have done is your fault. Your father decided to build the ledger. That was his choice, and it was the right choice. Everything that came from it, that's on them, not on you." She looked at him for a moment. "You sound very certain about that," she said. "I am." "Why?" He thought about it honestly. "Because I've been in rooms with men who made the other choice," he said. "Men who saw the same thing your father saw and looked the other way because looking the other way was easier. And I've watched what looking the other way produced." He paused. "Your father looked directly at it. That takes a specific kind of person." She was quiet. "You take after him," he said. Something moved in her face, deep and fast, and then controlled, the way it always was. But he had seen it this time, and he thought she knew he'd seen it. She looked out the window at the passing dark. "I used to be angry at him," she said, "for putting us in danger, for thinking he could change something." She paused. "I was 14, and my father was gone and I was running, and I was furious at him for years." Her voice was flat and precise, the way voices were when they were delivering facts they had processed into neutrality through sheer repetition. Then somewhere around year 5, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was... She stopped. I understood, finally, why he did it. Because it was right, Lucien said. Because he couldn't live with himself otherwise. She turned back from the window. That's what I understood. Not that it was heroic, just that it was the only choice he could actually make and still be the person he was. A pause. I think about that a lot, being unable to make the other choice because of who you are. He looked at her. She looked at him. In the front seat of a vehicle on a dark highway at 4 a.m, with snow driving against the windshield and 4 men dead behind them, and the work not finished. In that specific moment, without architecture or strategy between them, he understood something about what was happening that he had been not examining for days with the specific deliberateness of a man who understood the danger of examining it. He turned back to face front. Albany at 6 a.m. in winter was gray and freezing and mostly empty. The streets held the particular abandoned quality of a city not yet committed to the day. Storefronts dark, traffic lights cycling through their colors for no one. Aldrich pulled into the parking structure of a downtown office building and parked on the 3rd level. The prosecutor was already there. His name was Harkin. Daniel Harkin, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Southern District Financial Fraud Division. He was 51, thin in the way of people who forgot to eat, and he had the expression of a man who had been pulled from sleep at 3 a.m. by a forensic accountant he trusted and had spent the drive upstate reconfiguring his understanding of what his morning was going to involve. He was standing beside a plain gray sedan with a briefcase and a thermos, and he looked like a man carrying more weight than he had expected to carry this early. Price was with him, on the phone, walking in tight circles, her voice carrying across the concrete structure in sharp, efficient bursts. Lucien got out of the SUV. Harkin looked at him, then at Evelyn, who came around the vehicle with the fireproof case. "You're Evelyn Marrow," Harkin said. "Yes." "Your father's case file has been sitting in a federal archive for 10 years. He looked at the case in her hands. "Is that part of it?" she said. "Enough." She set the case on the hood of Harkin's sedan and opened it. She laid the photograph negatives out in sequence, 12 in total, each one numbered in her father's handwriting along the margin. Harkin bent over them with the focused intensity of a man looking at something he had needed to see for a long time and hadn't expected to see tonight. He picked up the first negative. He looked at it for 20 seconds. He set it down. He looked at Evelyn. "The payments to Vane are documented," he said. 3 transactions. Dates, amounts, originating account. My father cross-referenced them to Vane's personal accounts through a banking contact he had in the Cayman routing network. She pointed to the 3rd negative. "This one shows the transaction chain. This one, the 5th, shows the confirmation that the funds cleared to a personal vehicle registered to Vane's home address." Harkin straightened up. He looked at Lucien. "I need to understand your involvement in bringing this to me." "I found her bleeding in the snow," Lucien said. "Everything after that is in the service of making sure the people who put her there answer for it." He paused. "How I operate otherwise is a separate conversation." "It's going to be a conversation," Harkin said. "I know." Harkin looked at the negatives again, picked up his phone. "I need to make a call," he said, and stepped away. Price appeared at Lucien's shoulder. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and the perpetually composed expression of someone who processed bad news faster than most people received it. "The IG's office duty officer has flagged Vane's warrant request for review," she said quietly. "It won't be processed until the flag is cleared. That buys 12 hours, maybe more." She paused. "The data he pulled from your server, it's sitting in the contractor system, unreviewed as of 30 minutes ago. If Harkin moves fast enough, he can get a protective order before Vane's people can do anything with it." "How fast?" "Hours, not days." She looked at him. "The audit findings I sent him in the car, the Romano financial routing through your legitimate entities, that's what he needs for jurisdiction. Financial fraud gives him the hook. Once he has the hook, the rest of the Marrow materials become part of the same investigation." Lucien nodded. Harkin came back. "I'm calling the duty judge at 6:30, he said. "I need an emergency protective order and a warrant to preserve the data on Vane's contractor system before it can be altered." He looked at Evelyn. I'm going to need a sworn statement from you about the provenance of these materials and your father's process for collecting them. I'll give you whatever you need, she said. This is going to move fast once it starts, he said. Vane will know within hours. He'll try to contain it. He looked at Lucian. He may try to use the Romano connection against you. Try to make the story about Black Hollow rather than about himself. That's his move, Lucien said. Let him make it. Harkin looked at him with the expression of a man recalibrating something. You understand what cooperating with this investigation means for you, Harkin said. I understand exactly what it means, Lucien said. Do your job. Harkin nodded once. He picked up the first negative again, handling it with the careful attention of a man who understood that what he was holding was the kind of evidence that appeared once and had to be handled correctly, or it was gone. He held it to the parking structure's overhead light. Your father was thorough, he said to Evelyn. He was the best at what he did, she said. That's why they killed him. Harkin set the negative down. He opened his briefcase. He began to work. Outside the parking structure, Albany was waking up in gray increments, lights coming on in buildings, the first cars appearing on the streets below. Snow had stopped falling. The sky above the city was the specific pale non-color of winter morning before the sun committed to rising, that hour when everything was still possible in either direction. Lucien stood at the parking structure's open side and looked at the city below and felt the morning air on his face and thought about Marco holding the estate with 31 men left. He thought about the shape of what came next, because it was not finished, not by distance. The negotiation with Harkin was beginning, not ending. Romano was wounded, but not destroyed. The men who had backed Matteo would need to be addressed one by one. It was going to be a long road. He heard Evelyn come up behind him. She stood beside him at the open edge of the structure, the fireproof case at her feet, looking at the city below. They stood without speaking for a while. When this is over, she said finally, whatever over looks like. She paused. What do you do? He thought about it. I don't know, he said. Which was true. He had not thought past the present emergency in a professional sense because the present emergency had consumed the available horizon. But underneath that, underneath the operational reality, there was something else he hadn't been examining, the same something he hadn't been examining in the vehicle. I don't know either, she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the city, her profile in the early light, sharp and tired and something beyond tired, something that was on the other side of tired, where the exhaustion had burned through and what was left was just the person, stripped of everything the running had required. He wanted to say something. He didn't say it. Behind them, Harkin's voice carried across the concrete. Devereaux, I need you in here. He turned. He went back to the sedan where Harkin had the negatives spread across the hood, and Price was cross-referencing the audit findings on a laptop, and the 6 a.m. light was coming in at a low angle through the parking structure's open sides. He sat down across from Harkin. He began. The next 2 hours were the kind of work that didn't look like anything from the outside. A man and a federal prosecutor sitting at the hood of a car in a parking structure, talking through documents, establishing provenance, mapping the connections between financial records and operational decisions, and the long paper trail of a corruption network that had been running for over a decade. Evelyn sat across from them for most of it, answering Harkin's questions in the precise, organized way of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for years and had simply been waiting for the right room. At 8:15, Harkin's phone rang. He answered it, listened, and the expression on his face changed. Not dramatically, not in the way expressions changed in movies, but in the small specific way that professional faces changed when the thing they had been working toward had started moving. The protective order is granted, he said. Vane's data pool is frozen. Evelyn let out a breath. Harkin looked at his phone, then at Lucy N., then at Evelyn. It's moving, he said. I need to go. He gathered the negatives, carefully, each one back in the sequence Evelyn had laid them in, and placed them in an evidence envelope that he sealed and signed across the seal. He looked at Evelyn. Your father, he said. I want you to know, people in my office have known for years that the Carver Task Force failure wasn't procedural. We couldn't prove it. We couldn't find the thread. He paused. You just gave us the thread. She looked at him without expression. Make it count, she said. He left. Price followed him, already on the phone, already managing the next piece of the machinery. Aldrich stayed with the vehicle, and Lucien stood in the parking structure with Evelyn in the thin winter morning light, the case empty at her feet, the negatives gone with Harkin. The thing they had been building toward for the past days finally handed to someone with the authority to do something with it. He looked at her. She looked at him. Her face was something. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter and more complicated than either. The expression of a person who had just put down something they had been carrying for a decade and were feeling the absence of the weight. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Marco. He answered it. Marco's voice was different from the earlier calls, tight in a way that was not the tight of operational pressure, but the tight of something that had gone specifically and irreversibly wrong. Lucien, he said. Romano just called the estate direct line. What did he say? He said, Marco stopped. Then, he has someone. He took someone during the withdrawal from the estate. Lucien went very still. Who? He said. A pause. One of the kitchen staff, Marco said. Young woman. She was outside during the breach. Another pause. He's saying she's not the one he wants. He's saying it was a mistake, but he's keeping her. Lucien looked at Evelyn. She read his face. He's saying, Marco continued, that he wants a meeting. Tonight. Just Lucien, no security. Location of his choice. Marco's voice tightened further. He sent a photo. Lucien, she's... Where? Lucien said. Marco gave him the location. Lucien looked at it. Then he looked at Evelyn, and he looked at the empty case at her feet, and he looked at the parking structure wall behind her, and he thought about 31 men at the estate and 4 bodies and a federal protective order and a prosecutor driving south with photograph negatives in an evidence envelope. And he thought about the meeting Romano wanted, in a location Romano had chosen, at a time Romano had set, with conditions Romano had dictated. He thought about all the ways that meeting ended, and he thought about what happened if he didn't go. Tell him I'll be there, he said. He ended the call. Evelyn was watching him. Romano took a hostage during the withdrawal, he said. He wants a meeting tonight. She understood immediately what kind of meeting it was. He could see it in her face. The calculation running, the geometry of it, the fact that she had spent 10 years watching Romano's playbook and knew exactly what a meeting like this was designed to produce. You're going, she said. Yes. That's what he wants. You, in a room, on his terms, without... I know what it is, Lucien said. His voice was level. There's a person in Romano's hands because of what I chose. That's not something I can sit with. Lucien, no. He looked at her directly. This is not a debate. She looked back at him with an expression that was fierce and frustrated and something else. Something that had been building across days of corridors and conversations and the specific proximity of people under sustained pressure. Something that was as inconvenient as it was undeniable. Then I'm coming with you, she said. Absolutely not. You need me. She stepped toward him. Romano doesn't just want the meeting. He wants the ledger. He wants me. If you walk in there without leverage, you are not leverage. You are not a bargaining chip. You are not... I'm the only thing he actually wants. Her voice cut through his with a precision that stopped him. Which means I'm the only thing that can end this tonight. Not the prosecutor, not the protective order, not 31 men at the estate. She held his eyes without flinching. Me, walking into that room. He looked at her. She looked back. And in the 8 a.m. light of an Albany parking structure, with Harkin's car disappearing down the exit ramp and Price's voice fading in the stairwell, and the city below them beginning its ordinary day entirely unaware of what had been built and broken and rebuilt in the past 96 hours. In that light, with that look between them, Lucien Devereaux understood that the most dangerous thing that had happened to him in 15 years of running the Eastern Seaboard's most feared criminal operation was not the fires in Brooklyn, or the dead men in the snow, or the federal data pull, or the 60 men in 6 vehicles coming up his mountain. It was the woman standing in front of him. and the fact that she was right. He held her eyes for a long moment. Then he said the thing he had spent 15 years not saying to anyone. I can't keep you safe if you're in that room. Well, she didn't look away. Then trust me to keep myself safe, she said. He reached out. He put one hand against her jaw. Carefully, the way he had in the chapel during the storm, the first soft thing she had felt in years, the gesture that had been interrupted by gunfire and had been unfinished ever since. And he held it there for exactly the length of time it took to understand that this was the decision, that everything before it had been prologue, that the choice was not between the meeting and no meeting, or between safe and unsafe, but between keeping her safe and trusting her to survive. He let his hand fall. Tonight, he said, we go together, but we go my way. She nodded once. He turned and walked to the parking structure's open edge and stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides and the cold morning air against his face and the city below him going about its ordinary business. And he understood in the specific way that men understood things when the understanding arrived too late to change anything. That the version of himself that had stood at the window of Black Hollow 4 days ago, watching the summit guests leave, calculating the geometry of the situation with the clean detachment of a man who had learned to treat everything as a problem with a solution, that version was not the version standing here now. Something had shifted, not broken, not softened into something useless. Shifted. The way tectonic things shifted, underneath, where you couldn't see it, until the surface changed. He turned back. Call Aldrich, he said, and then I need 2 hours to prepare. The location Romano had chosen was St. Lazarus Cathedral. It sat at the end of a closed street in a part of the city that had been declining for 30 years, a massive stone structure built for a congregation that no longer existed, its windows boarded on the lower level, its doors sealed by a city ordinance 3 years ago after the roof had partially collapsed over the nave. The surrounding blocks were empty lots and shuttered buildings, the kind of urban geography that existed in deliberate obscurity, that provided the cover of abandonment. Lucien knew it. He had known it for years. He had, in fact, used it twice before for purposes that had nothing to do with the current situation, which meant Romano had done his research, or someone had told him, and Lucien filed this detail in the back of his mind and left it there for later consideration. He spent the 2 hours preparing, not weapons, not manpower. He had been told no security, and he understood the terms clearly enough to understand that Romano would enforce them and that the enforcement would be directed at the hostage. What he prepared was information, and the architecture of how it would be used. He called Harkin at 9. The meeting tonight, he said. Romano's location. I need you to know where I am. Harkin's voice had the quality of a man who had been awake for 36 hours and was running on professional obligation. I can't protect you in a private location, Devereaux. I'm not asking for protection, Lucien said. I'm asking you to know the address. And I'm asking you to be prepared to move on it at a signal. What signal? You'll know it when you hear it. He paused. Vane's warrant is frozen. His data pool is under protective order. You have the negatives. You have the audit. He paused again. What you don't have yet is Matteo Romano in a room where he's already committed to a criminal act in front of a federal witness. A long silence. That's not something I can officially sanction, Harkin said carefully. I'm not asking you to sanction anything, Lucien said. I'm asking you to know the address. Another silence. I know the address, Harkin said. Lucien ended the call. He went to find Evelyn. She was in Aldrich's car in the parking structure, the empty fireproof case on the seat beside her, writing in a small notebook with focused concentration. He got in beside her. She didn't look up immediately, finished the sentence she was writing, then closed the notebook. What are you writing? He said. A statement, she said. Everything I know about Romano's financial structure, everything my father documented, and everything I've added in the past 2 years. She held up the notebook. If tonight goes wrong, if I don't come out of that building, this goes to Harkin directly. He looked at the notebook. Give it to Aldrich now, he said. Not as a contingency, as a backup. He paused. We're both coming out of that building, but Harkin should have everything regardless. She looked at him. Then she opened the door and walked around to the driver's side where Aldrich was standing and handed him the notebook and spoke to him quietly for a moment. Aldrich took it, looked at it, put it inside his jacket. She came back, got back in. "I need to tell you something," she said. Now is exactly when." She turned to face him in the confined space of the back seat, and her expression was the most unguarded he had seen it across all the days of careful architecture, stripped of the control not by circumstance, but by deliberate choice. The specific vulnerability of someone who had decided that the cost of not saying something was higher than the cost of saying it. "I came to Black Hollow to use the summit. I planned it for 18 months. I was going to find the right man in that room and make a deal and walk away with the ledger deployed and Romano finished." She paused. "And then I got recognized in the garden, and someone put their hands around my throat, and I woke up in a room with you sitting in the chair beside my bed." He waited. "Everything I told you was true," she said. "I need you to know that. Not because it's strategically useful for you to know it, because it's true. And because I've spent 10 years not telling people true things about myself." She held his eyes. "And I don't want to walk into that building tonight carrying something I didn't say." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know it was true," he said. "How?" "Because I know what lying looks like," he said. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I know the specific quality of a lie. When you talked about your father, when you talked about Prague, when you told me what Vane did. There's no architecture in it. It's just what happened." He paused. "That's rarer than you know." She looked at him with that expression again, the one that moved fast and got controlled, except this time the control came slower. "I also need you to know," he said, "that the reason I'm sitting in this car instead of sending you somewhere safe with Aldrich and going to that building alone." He stopped, started again. "I told myself it was strategy, that you were right about being leverage, about being the only thing he actually wants, about it ending faster with you in the room." He paused. "That's all true, but it's not the only reason." She waited. "I don't want to walk away from you," he said. "Even for one building, even for 2 hours." He said it the way he said the things that were hardest, flatly, without decoration, without the performance of feeling because the feeling itself was too real to perform. That's not something I've said to anyone in a very long time. The car was quiet. Outside, Albany continued its morning. "Then let's not walk away from each other," she said. He reached across and took her hand, not with urgency, not with the practical grip of a man moving someone through dangerous terrain, but carefully, the way you held something you understood was not given twice. She let him. They stayed like that for a moment. Then he straightened up. "We have work to do," he said. She almost smiled. "We do," she said. St. Lazarus Cathedral at 8 p.m. was a monument to everything the city had left behind. Lucian and Evelyn walked to the approach on foot from 2 blocks north. Aldrich had dropped them at the perimeter and was parked on a parallel street with Harkin's number in his phone and instructions that were simple and unconditional. Around them, the neighborhood was dark and quiet in the specific way of places that had passed through useful and come out the other side. The cathedral's main doors had been unblocked. Someone had removed the city seal and the padlock. The doors stood slightly open, interior darkness visible beyond them, and the faint movement of warmer air coming through the gap. The building had been heated recently, which meant preparation. Lucian put his hand against the door. He looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. He pushed the door open and they walked in. The interior of St. Lazarus was vast and damaged and cold despite whatever heating had been brought in. The kind of cold that lived in stone walls and high ceilings, and didn't leave because of portable heaters. Candles had been placed along the remains of the pews, dozens of them, which threw the space into amber and shadow, illuminating the broken stone columns and the collapsed section of roof above the rear of the nave where the sky was visible through the gap, winter stars showing in a strip of black above the destruction. Men stood in the shadows along the walls. Lucien counted 8. Professionals. The stillness of them was the contractor stillness he had noted at the estate, not Romano's usual street soldiers. This was Vane's contribution, he understood. This was the off-book apparatus that had been running the operational side of tonight. At the front of the nave where the altar had been, Matteo Romano stood. He was 31 and looked older than that in the candlelight. The specific aging of men who had inherited violence rather than built it, who wore the weight of it as performance rather than character. He was dressed for the setting in the theatrical way of men who understood that situations like this were about more than outcome. They were about image, about the story that would be told afterward. Beside him, seated in a chair, was the hostage, a young woman from the kitchen staff, her wrists tied, a bruise at her cheekbone. She was conscious and frightened, but not broken, and when she saw Lucien come through the door, something in her face shifted toward relief. Behind Romano, at the edge of the altar, stood a man Lucien had not seen before. 50-something, close-cropped gray hair, federal build, the posture of it, the specific way of holding the body that came from years of institutional physical culture. He wore civilian clothes, but they fit him the way civilian clothes fit men, who spent most of their lives in different ones. Curtis Vane, in person, for the first time. Evelyn saw him at the same moment. Lucien felt it, the way her hand tightened in his, a single involuntary contraction, there and then gone. She released his hand, stood on her own. "Lucien," Romano said. His voice carried easily across the ruined nave. "You brought her." "I did," Lucien said. "That surprises me." "It shouldn't." Lucien walked forward, Evelyn beside him, until they were 20 feet from the altar. "I don't leave things unfinished." Romano looked at Evelyn. Something moved in his face. Not attraction, not warmth. The flat proprietary assessment of a man looking at something he had been trying to acquire for a decade and had finally gotten in front of him. "Evelyn Marrow," he said. "Matteo Romano," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. She looked at Vane. "And you," she said. "Curtis Vane." She held his eyes across the distance. "You look older." Vane's expression didn't change. He looked at her with the blankness of a professional who had learned long ago not to show anything in rooms like this. But his jaw tightened, one small muscle under the skin, there and visible if you were looking for it. "The ledger," Romano said. He wasn't looking at Vane. He was looking at Evelyn. "Tonight it ends. You give me access to the physical components, the woman goes free, and we have a conversation about how this arrangement moves forward." "There's no arrangement," Evelyn said. "There's whatever arrangement I decide there is," Romano said. His voice hadn't changed its register, still that practiced smoothness, but something underneath it had tightened. "Your father thought the same thing, that there was a position from which he could dictate terms. You know how that—" "My father was betrayed by the man standing behind you," Evelyn said. She didn't raise her voice. She said it the way she said facts, with the flat precision that was more devastating than anger. "He was building a case that would have destroyed your family's operation. He trusted a federal agent who was on your payroll to protect him. That agent gave you his location and his timeline, and you killed him." She paused. "I've known that since I was 14 years old. I've been waiting to say it in a room where it matters for 10 years. Romano looked at Vane. Vane said nothing. "It doesn't matter what you know," Romano said, turning back. "What matters is where the physical components are, and whether you'd like to walk out of here or not." "It matters," Lucien said, "because the DOJ Inspector General's office received an anonymous referral this morning regarding Agent Vane's activities." He said it the same way he said everything in rooms like this, with the measured, unhurried calm of a man who had learned that volume was the refuge of people who weren't certain of what they were saying. The referral included documented evidence of payments from a Romano account to a personal vehicle registered to Agent Vane. Dates, amounts, routing records in Adrian Marrow's handwriting. He paused. The physical negatives are currently in the possession of an AUSA in the Southern District under an evidence preservation order. The room had gone very quiet. Vane had gone still in the specific way of a man whose training told him to stay still when the situation was reconfiguring around him faster than he could process. Romano's expression was harder to read. It was shifting between things, cycling through responses, the emotional machinery visible in the way it rarely was. "You've been busy," Romano said finally. "I have," Lucien said. "It doesn't change tonight," Romano said. Whatever you filed, whatever you gave to whoever, tonight this woman is in this room and the ledger is undeployed, and that doesn't change with paperwork. The ledger, Evelyn said, is already deployed. Romano looked at her. The physical negatives that Lucien described, she said. Those aren't the complete ledger. They're the authentication component. The documentation itself, everything my father compiled, every financial record, every transaction chain, every name, I've been digitizing it for 2 years. In 18 months of planning this approach, I built a distribution system. She held Romano's eyes without wavering. If I don't transmit a check-in code by midnight tonight, that documentation goes automatically to 7 recipients, 4 journalists, 2 federal prosecutors outside the Organized Crime Division, 1 international law enforcement body. She paused. Your financial architecture, your political network, your judges, your federal assets. Her eyes moved to Vane. All of it, with your name attached to every transaction. Vane moved. He came off the altar step toward Evelyn with the speed of a man who had stopped calculating and started reacting. One hand going to the inside of his jacket, and Lucien was already moving to intercept. He covered the 10 feet between them in time to get his hand on Vane's wrist before the weapon cleared the jacket, and what followed was brief and ugly and not dramatic in the way that movies made these things dramatic but practical. The specific controlled brutality of a man who knew how bodies worked and where they were vulnerable. And when it ended, Vane was on the stone floor of the nave with Lucien's knee in his back and his weapon on the ground 4 feet away. The 8 contractors along the walls had their weapons raised. Lucien kept his knee where it was. He looked at Romano. Romano stood at the altar with 8 armed men and a hostage, and a man who, until 30 seconds ago, had been his federal insurance policy and who was now face down on the floor of a ruined building. Romano looked at Evelyn. If I shoot you right now, he said, the code doesn't transmit. I already sent it, she said, before we walked through the door. She paused. You shoot me, nothing changes. The documentation goes out at midnight regardless. Another pause. But if I transmit the stop code in the next 4 hours, the automatic distribution halts. The material goes to Harkin only under the existing evidence preservation order, a federal investigation that you and your attorneys will have time to respond to through legal channels. Romano's jaw worked. You're offering me a deal, he said. I'm offering you the difference between controlled exposure and total destruction, she said. My father built the ledger to be used, not to be a bomb. He wanted accountability, courts, evidence evaluated and acted on through a process. She held his eyes. That process is already running. The question is whether you're in front of it or under it. The candles threw their unsteady light across the nave. Above them, through the gap in the roof, the winter sky was very dark and very clear, stars visible in the strip of open black. Romano stood very still. He looked at Vane on the floor. He looked at the 8 men along the walls who were looking at each other with the professional uncertainty of men whose situation had changed faster than their briefing had accounted for. He looked at Lucien. Let him up, Romano said. No, Lucien said. Romano's eyes narrowed. He gave your father to you, Lucien said. He gave Adrian Marrow's location to you. He put his hands around this woman's neck in my garden. He ran a data operation against my estate. He kept his knee exactly where it was. He doesn't get up until Harkin's people come through that door. You called them already, Romano said. Not a question. Aldrich called them 4 minutes ago, Lucien said. The signal was me walking through the front door. Romano looked at the nave entrance. He looked at the altar behind him. He looked at Evelyn. Something moved through his face in the candlelight. Not surrender, not defeat in the clean sense, but something more complicated than that. The specific expression of a man who had inherited something, who had been told his entire life what the inheritance was worth and how to protect it, and who was standing in the moment when the cost of that protection had finally exceeded the thing being protected. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the 8 contractors. Stand down, he said. Weapons lowered. He looked at Lucien. The woman in the chair, he said. That was Vane's decision, not mine. I know whose decision it was, Lucien said. That doesn't absolve the choice to go along with it. Romano said nothing. He moved to the front pew and sat down and put his hands on his knees and stared at the floor in front of him with the expression of a man who is going to need a very good attorney very soon and understood this. The doors at the rear of the nave opened. Harkin came through first, flanked by two men with DOJ credentials visible on lanyards. Behind them, two federal agents in body armor. Behind them, a woman Lucien didn't recognize who had the bearing of someone from the Inspector General's office. Formal, deliberate, carrying a briefcase. Harkin looked at the room. He looked at Vane on the floor. He looked at Lucien. "Productive evening," he said. "Mostly," Lucien said. He stood up, stepped back from Vane, who was helped to his feet by one of the federal agents and immediately cuffed. The expression on Vane's face as the cuffs went on was the expression of a man experiencing the end of a very long performance. Not surprised, not devastated, just finished. The blankness had broken into something flatter and more honest. The face of a man who had been running a particular story about himself for years and had just run out of story. One of Harkin's people crossed to the hostage and cut the binding at her wrists. She stood up, unsteady, and was guided toward the door. Evelyn crossed the nave and crouched beside where the woman had been sitting and picked up something from the floor, a water bottle that had been left nearby, untouched. She handed it to the woman as she passed. The woman looked at her. "Thank you," she said. Evelyn nodded. It was small, and it was not the kind of thing that would appear in any account of what happened that night. But Lucien saw it. Harkin's people moved through the nave with professional efficiency, processing the contractors, beginning the documentation of the space. Romano was read his rights in the measured, procedural tone of an attorney who had done it many times and understood that the tone mattered. Romano listened, said nothing, accepted it. Lucien moved to the side of the nave and stood near one of the columns, out of the immediate activity, and watched it happen. The machinery of it, the legal apparatus grinding into motion around the things they had spent days building toward. He felt tired. Not the dangerous tired, the depleted kind that impaired judgment. The other kind. The tired that came at the end of something, when the body and the mind finally acknowledged that they had been running at a deficit for days and had permission now to begin the accounting. Evelyn appeared beside him. She stood against the column and looked at the activity in the nave and said nothing for a moment. "The stop code," he said. "You actually sent it." "Yes," she said. "From the parking structure, 2 hours before we came here." She paused. "The automatic distribution was real. The offer was real." She looked at Romano, surrounded now by Harkin's people. "My father wanted accountability, not obliteration. There's a difference." "He raised you well," Lucien said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to have to testify," she said, "to everything, the whole 10 years, my father's process, the ledger's contents, what I know about the network." She paused. "It's going to take a long time." "Yes," he said. "Harkin will want me close. The prosecution will take years." She looked at him. "I won't be able to disappear again. I'll have to be here, stationary, visible." She said it the way a person said something that was both frightening and necessary in equal measure. "Black Hollow is stationary," he said. She looked at him. "It's been a fortress for 15 years, he said. "It can be something else." He paused. "If you want it to be." She looked at him for a long time, not assessing exits, not running calculations, just looking at him with the expression of a person who was allowing themselves, for the first time in a very long time, to consider a future that wasn't defined by what was behind them. "I'll think about it," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair enough," he said. They stood there together against the column while the federal apparatus did what it did, and the candles burned down, and the winter sky above the broken roof showed its stars without comment. The weeks that followed were the most complicated of Lucien Devereaux's life, which was a category with substantial competition. Harkin moved fast. The Inspector General's investigation into Vane opened formally within 72 hours, and Vane, with the payment records, the transaction documentation, and a federal attorney who clearly understood the mathematics of cooperation, began providing information within a week. The Carver Task Force failure was formally reopened. 3 federal judges were placed under investigation. Two resigned before charges were filed. Romano's attorneys were expensive and creative and delayed everything they could delay. But the ledger's documentation was thorough in the way that Adrian Marrow's work had always been thorough. Not just the what, but the how. The paper trail built with the meticulous care of a man who understood that evidence was only as good as its chain of custody. The financial records held up under every challenge. By spring, the first guilty pleas began. Lucien's own situation was navigated with the specific care that situations like his required. The cooperation with Harkin's investigation bought specific protections carefully defined and held to with the precision that both sides understood was necessary. There were conversations that were not comfortable. There were accountings that cost real things. The legitimate holdings were restructured under Price's supervision in ways that produced a smaller, cleaner operation than what had existed before. Several arrangements were ended. Several people moved on. The organization that emerged from the spring was different from the one that had hosted the winter summit. Smaller, more careful. Lucien would have said leaner, but what he actually thought in the private hours was that it felt less like a machine and more like something a person had made choices about. Marco stayed. Marco would always stay. It was a character trait rather than a decision. Price renegotiated her retainer to 3 times its previous value, and Lucien paid it without discussion. Garrett's family received a sum that no official explanation would ever attach to a source, and the source was never discussed. Evelyn stayed at Black Hollow. Not immediately. There were weeks of testimony and deposition and the grinding procedural machinery of a federal investigation that required her presence in rooms that were not comfortable. She stayed in Albany for the first month, close to Harkin's office, available for the endless questions that came as the investigation expanded. Lucien drove down twice a week without being asked. He sat in the waiting rooms outside the federal offices and worked on his phone and was there when she came out. She never asked him to come. She never told him to stop. In late February, she came back to Black Hollow. It was different in Winter's Retreat. The snow pulling back from the lower mountain, the estate's grounds emerging from their white covering in brown and gray increments, the world doing what it always did, which was continue regardless of what had happened in it. She walked the property for the first time without hurrying, without scanning exits, without the readiness held in her shoulders like a drawn string. Lucien watched her from the north study window. He watched her stop at the edge of the garden where he had found her, the specific patch of ground near the estate wall where the snow had been red and her hand had been wrapped around the silver pendant. She stood there for a long time. He didn't go out. When she came back inside, she was carrying the pendant. She had found it at the garden wall. It had been there since the night of the attack, buried under snow for 3 months, emerging now as the thaw worked through the ground. She stood in the corridor outside the north study and turned it over in her hand. He came out. She held it up. It was a small silver disc, worn smooth on one side where a thumb had rubbed it over many years, and on the other side was an engraving. Too worn to read completely, but clearly letters, and clearly in a hand that was not hers. "My father gave it to my mother," she said. "She gave it to me before she died. I've had it for 17 years. She paused. "I thought I lost it in the garden." She closed her hand around it. "I thought it was gone." He looked at her closed hand. "Some things come back," he said. She looked at him. It was a simple thing, an ordinary thing. The kind of sentence that would have meant nothing in any other context and meant something now because of everything it stood behind. She unclosed her hand and looked at the pendant again. "I want to tell you about my father," she said. "Not the accountant, not the case. Him." She looked up. "I've never told anyone. The 10 years of running, there was no one I could tell." She paused. "I want to tell you. I want to hear it," he said. They went into the study. She sat in the chair by the window. He sat across from her. Outside, the mountain was doing its slow return to color, the gray and brown and eventual green of a landscape remembering what it was after the long cold. She talked for a long time, about a man who had cooked badly but enthusiastically on Sundays, who had kept books stacked on every available surface, who had explained the moral architecture of what he was doing to his daughter with the careful honesty of a father who believed children deserved the truth about the world, who had been afraid, She knew that now, from the distance of adulthood, but had moved forward anyway, because the alternative was living in a way he couldn't live with. Lucien listened. He asked questions, sometimes. Small ones, the questions that showed he was following not just the story, but the person inside it. She answered them. Outside, afternoon became evening. At some point, without either of them noting it as a transition, the conversation moved from past to present. From Adrian Marrow's kitchen on Sundays, to the investigation's current status, to what Harkin had said last week, to what Price had found in the restructured portfolio, to what Marco thought about the Boston crew. Ordinary things. The ordinary things of two people building the shared vocabulary of proximity. When the light was fully gone and the study was lit by the desk lamp only, she stood up to leave. She stopped at the door. "The first night," she said, "when I woke up and tried to run. You caught me." "Yes," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "Not of dying. I told you that." "You were afraid of being found," he said. "I was afraid of letting someone find me," she said. "There's a difference." She held his eyes across the lamplit room. "I've been afraid of that my whole life, since I was 14. She paused. "I'm less afraid of it now." He looked at her. She looked back. "Good," he said. She left. He sat in the study alone for a while, with the mountain dark outside and the estate quiet around him and the desk lamp throwing its small, specific circle of light. He thought about 15 years. He thought about the winter summit and the blood in the snow and the decision he had made when he lifted her from the garden. He thought about all the ways that decision should have gone differently. All the rational calculus that should have produced a different outcome should have kept him insulated from the cost that had followed. He thought about Garrett. He thought about 4 men in the snow. He thought about what Evelyn had said about her father. The only choice he could actually make and still be the person he was. He understood it now in a way he hadn't when she said it. Not because he had become someone different, but because he had become more precisely what he already was. And what he already was had been waiting for a long time for something worth the cost. Spring came fully in April. The investigation expanded. Guilty pleas accumulated. The political network Adrian Marrow had documented began to collapse in the way that networks collapsed when the evidence was thorough, not all at once, but in a sequence, each domino triggering the next, each cooperating witness pointing to the next name. Vane received 22 years. Romano's sentencing was scheduled for fall. The operation at Black Hollow ran quietly and smaller than before, and without the elaborate deceptions that had been necessary when the exposure was greater. It was not legitimate. Lucien understood himself clearly enough not to dress it in that word. But it was contained and it was managed, and the people who depended on it were not the kind of people who had other options. And Lucien paid attention to the distinction between those two categories in ways he had not always paid attention to. On a morning in late April, Evelyn was on the east balcony when he found her. She was looking at the mountains. The snow was gone from the lower elevations. The tree line was in the first tentative green of the season, that specific tender green that didn't last, that was only possible for 2 weeks before it deepened into summer. The sky was clear and cold and very blue. She heard him come out. "It looks different," she said, "in spring." "It does," he agreed. He stood beside her at the railing. Below them, the garden was coming back. The frozen ground had opened. The beds were showing the first tentative growth of things that had survived under the ice. "I used to think," she said, "that I wanted to finish the ledger and then disappear. Find somewhere with no history. Start clean." She paused. "I thought clean meant empty. No connection to anything." "And now," he said. She looked at the mountains. "Now I think clean is the wrong word," she said. "I think the word is honest." She turned to look at him. "I'd rather live honestly than cleanly." He looked at her. This woman who had walked into the lion's den on purpose with 18 months of planning and a silver pendant and the unfinished business of her father's life, who had been found bleeding in the snow and had refused, across days of compounding danger, to be reduced to what had been done to her, who had sat in his study in the lamplight and talked about a man who cooked badly on Sundays. He reached out. He tucked a strand of hair back from her face with the same deliberateness as every other choice he made. Slow, considered, the gesture of a man who understood that some things deserved that care. She let him. He left his hand at her jaw for a moment. The gesture from the chapel, the one that had been interrupted, finally finished. She put her hand over his. They stayed like that in the April morning, above the garden where the snow had been red, above the mountain that had held them both through the winter, in the specific, ordinary, extraordinary moment of two people who had survived something hard together, deciding, without saying it, that survival was not the end of the story. Below them, the estate was quiet. The guards made their rounds. The garden grew. The mountain was green against the blue sky. And the man who had built his kingdom on cold precision stood on his own balcony in the warmth of an April morning with his hand held by a woman who had stopped running and felt something move through him that he had no strategic use for and no intention of analyzing and no desire to set aside. The underworld still said his name with fear. They still crossed streets when his cars came through, still lowered their voices when his people were in the room, still calculated the cost of drawing his attention before they made decisions that fell within his territory. But in the corridors of Black Hollow, something had changed in the quality of the silence. It was warmer than it used to be. Lucien Devereaux had spent 15 years building a house that kept everything out. He had not expected to spend the 16th learning what it felt like when something got in. He had not expected to be grateful for it. He was.